Morning, Jared.
Hello, Grace. How are you?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Are you home?
No, I'm in DC.
How cold was it? Oh, I see you're drinking too.
Yeah, I think it's one of these weeks where we snap from winter to spring like within 48 hours. It's pretty warm.
Those changes are in Washington.
Yeah.
By the way, I'd like to talk to you later about.
Definitely.
Hey, Jared,
Yes, ma'am.
you know that the acting commissioner on Bureau Reclamation is Camille.
Yeah, I noticed that. Nice
She
to
is
have a friendly face.
She is a great person, very well versed on it.
You trained her well.
Well, I think Nevada Senator did that. I just ended up her career. Not ended up, but started her career. She is a wonderful individual and very capable. And I'm hoping that they'll name her commissioner because she'll do a great job for us.
That'd be
For
great.
all
I
of
think
us.
I'm meeting with her this week or next week, but I was delighted to see that.
Great. She is the first Filipino.
Excellent.
Have you met her personally?
Oh yeah, many times.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know who she is then.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I give my hardest recommendation for her.
I'm sure that mattered.
as parties, as members of the public who at times still crowd into our, when we don't have the coronavirus pandemic, still crowd into our public galleries to watch proceedings.
Morning, Alvio.
Good morning.
How are you?
Okay, how's everybody? Hi, Julia.
That's fine. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Steve.
Hello.
Specifically in the case of the San Diego.
Albio, hello.
If one of the high-tech capitals of the country there in San Diego, if a patent case comes up,
Jared, hello.
tell us what the process would be and how the ability to.
Hi, Eddie. Federica.
Congresswoman, we'll make sure that when you speak, that your TV and background noise are off so that they can hear.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Just for informational purposes, while the hearing has not begun yet, audio is streaming out at the moment.
We can't get out. It should be in the drawer underneath. Yep, there you go.
Welcome to the best committee, best subcommittee in town.
I want to welcome everyone to today's hearing. It's good to be back in person at the House with a new session of Congress. This morning, we will be discussing the use of enforcement to promote traffic safety and the equity implications of it. Now, this is a subject we could take up and probably would have taken up at any time. But this is an appropriate time to take it up because this is Black History Month and where some of the issues have indeed come from. This is the first Subcommittee on Highways and Transit hearing. Sorry, I needed to go through the usual business. I ask unanimous consent that chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing without objection, so order. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing without objection, so ordered. 4 members participating remotely, and it looks like most members are. Let me remind you of key regulations from the House Committee on Rules. Members must be visible on video to be considered in attendance and to participate unless experiencing connectivity issues. Members must also continue to use the video function for the remainder of the time they are attending this meeting and hearing unless experiencing connectivity issues or other technical problems, and you know how to be in touch with us if you are experiencing technical problems. If a member is experiencing any connectivity issues or other technical problems, please inform committee staff as soon as possible so you can receive attendance. Just go to the chat function available for members on Cisco WebEx platform for this purpose, or you can call the committee's main phone line, 202-225-4472 for technical assistance by phone. Members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. However, for security reasons, members may maintain a connection to the software platform while not in attendance, and I'm having to be in another committee doing precisely that at this moment. It is the responsibility of each member seeking recognition to unmute when their microphone prior to speaking and to keep their microphone muted when not speaking to avoid inadvertent background noise. As the chair of today's meeting and hearing, I will make a good faith effort to provide every member experiencing connectivity issues an opportunity to participate fully in the hearing. If you have any documents that you want submitted to the record, please have your staff email your document to documenttni@mail.house.gov. Now, proceeding with my statement about why we're having this hearing, a hearing we could have at any time, but it seemed that Black History Month was a good time to hear it. Our first subcommittee hearing of the 117th Congress does show the importance of this issue and our commitment to making highways and roadways safer and free from discrimination for all users. This subcommittee authorizes funding for states, tribes, and U.S. territories to pursue traffic safety efforts through the State and Community Highway Safety Program, commonly referred to as Section 402. We also authorize tiered grants aimed at addressing national traffic safety priorities, commonly referred to as Section 405. States can spend their traffic safety funds on a variety of activities, such as community education and outreach on the importance of using seat belts or improvements to state traffic record databases. States can also spend their funds on enforcement for traffic safety laws. A large portion of traffic safety grants go to law enforcement agencies. In fiscal year 2018, states spent over $200 million of their Section 402 and Section 405 funds on law enforcement. It is estimated that more than 20 million drivers are pulled over each year, making traffic stops one of the primary interactions between the public and law enforcement. So it is crucial we understand how and against whom traffic safety laws are enforced. Parenthetically, I have read of increased traffic speed during this pandemic. Apparently, people think you can go fast because there are not many people on the road, and as a result, there are increasing number of accidents on the road. Today, we will hear witnesses describe not only the impacts of traffic safety enforcement, which disproportionately affect people of color, but methods to improve trust between communities and law enforcement to bring about safe, equitable, and just outcomes in these interactions. We will also hear about the importance of using traffic safety resources to address problems that lead to injuries and deaths, such as impaired driving, rather than traffic stops that are used as a sweeping tool to interact with communities. Targeting resources is necessary to ensure that we actually move the needle on traffic safety. I'm especially interested to hear testimony from Ken Barone of Central Connecticut State University. The reason I am interested is he is program manager of the state of Connecticut's Racial Programming Prohibition Project, which is supported by a grant program I champion to prohibit racial profiling, known as Section 1906, that has been a great success. It is my understanding that other states are seeking to replicate the Connecticut model, so I very much look forward to hearing more about that program. Thank you for participating in today's hearing. I look forward to learning more about what the committee can do to ensure that traffic safety enforcement is fair as well as safe for all Americans. I would now like to call on my good friend, our ranking member, Mr. Davis, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks to all of our witnesses here today to discuss how the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration programs contribute to highway safety and implications related to equity. NHTSA has an important mission to save lives, prevent injuries, and reduce vehicle-related crashes. To help achieve this, NHTSA administers grant programs focused on deterring unsafe driver behaviors such as speeding and impaired or distracted driving, which are the primary causes of traffic crashes. States receive the NHTSA grants and are charged with overseeing their state safety program. NHTSA has a successful record and has significantly reduced highway fatalities since their high in 1973. 2019 traffic fatalities totaled 36,096, which represents a 34% reduction from the 1973 fatality level and a 2% reduction from the 2018 level. Sadly, based on preliminary data, NHTSA estimates that traffic fatalities increased in the first 9 months of 2020. NHTSA and the Governor's Highway Safety Association point to increases in risky driving and reductions in enforcement activities, just another deadly consequence from the COVID-19 pandemic. NHTSA's research indicates that enforcement is one of the most effective ways to combat unsafe driving behavior. Because of this, states have decided to expand some NHTSA grant funds on law enforcement activities. I believe that eliminating enforcement activities would lead to more dangerous roads and more fatalities and injuries. However, I also know that since the early days of this great nation, this country has had problems with discrimination and bias based on race, ethnicity, gender, religion, and socioeconomic factors. Look no further than my own district and the site of the 1908 Springfield race riots, one of those parts of our nation's history that is unfortunately credited with being one of the birthplaces of the NAACP. For the past few years, I've been working to designate this site as a National Historic Monument within the National Park Service. And I'll take this as an opportunity today to say I cannot wait to work with our colleague, Deb Haaland, when she is hopefully confirmed, as I would support, as the next Secretary of the United States Department of Interior. While Deb and I don't always agree on issues regarding energy independence, it'll be great to have a friend that we can call to address issues that are important to our great nation and righting the wrongs of things that happened in our nation history and highlighting those instances where we can come together and we can actually make sure that we learn about biases that have happened decades and centuries before we're here today. While more work needs to be done on this front, we were successful last year in getting the Trump administration to actually include this site on the African American Civil Rights Network created by our former colleague and my good friend Lacey Clay. We need to acknowledge that these issues continue to exist and must learn from past mistakes so that we can address them in a holistic way. I recognize NHTSA has no authority or jurisdiction over law enforcement or law enforcement activities, but the House Judiciary Committee has been focusing on this since 1997 when it passed H.R. 118, the Traffic Stops Statistics Study Act of 1998. This is important work. I pledge to assist the Judiciary Committee in examining these issues. And Chair Norton, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Thanks again to our witnesses. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis, for those opening remarks. I'd like to recommend the chairman of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio of Oregon.
Thanks, Madam Chair. This is an important hearing, and I expect we will get direction today and help from our witnesses in how we can deal with this long-term, persistent problem with traffic stops. It's clear the intent of the law is safety. Distracted driving, drunk driving, speeding, those are the principal causes of highway deaths. And, the slaughter goes on. You say, oh, well, we've made progress because, gee, the rate, the percentage, given miles traveled is down. 40,000 people lost 40,716 in 1994, but still in 2019, 36,096. And we know that distracted driving is growing as a problem. In fact, many states, including my state, now prohibit use of cell phones that are not hands-free. But there are myriad things being added to cars that are distracting, including startup companies that want to be able to display your email in a heads-up display right in front of you while you're driving. Great idea. Yeah, sure. So we need to deal with these safety issues. And that's what this money is supposed to be spent on. But we find that a number of states, and many states, have been using this for law enforcement in ways that are not meaningfully dealing with the major problems that cause traffic fatalities. In fact, they are being used in ways that, really reflect the systemic racism in the United States of America. Conscious or unconscious bias in terms of the stops that are being made. Meanwhile, we're not making the progress we want to make on lowering the fatality rate. In H.R. 2, we had several provisions that were aimed at addressing disparities and increasing transparency in traffic safety enforcement. As the chair discussed, H.R. 2 reauthorized and made improvements to the Section 1906 grant program to provide grants to states for collecting data on racial profiling during traffic stops. 23 states have applied for and received these funds, including my state. In fact, we found we have extraordinary problems of disparities in our largest city, in Portland, Oregon, something that was not obvious before. We need to root this out. H.R. 2 included an implicit bias research and training grant program to provide funds to universities for research and training of law enforcement to identify implicit bias during traffic stops. Today, we will hear testimony on how both of these tools can be used to address racial disparities in traffic safety enforcement. And hopefully we will get some other ideas that we could put into HR 2 as we rewrite the bill as part of a major infrastructure package in this Congress. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the chairman for his remarks, and I'm pleased that we got so far in perhaps the only full committee bill that got through last year in the Congress, ushered by our chairman. I would like to welcome our witnesses on our panel, Mr. Larry Santiago, who is the former chair of the Community Advisory Board, Maricopa County, Arizona, Ms. Lorraine Martin, President and CEO of the National Safety Council, Ms. Michelle Ramsey Hawkins, victim and survivor, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, pardon me, Mr. Ken Barone, Project Manager, Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy, Central Connecticut State University, and Mr. Rashawn Ray, Professor of Sociology, University of Maryland. I thank all of you for being here and look forward for your testimony. Before we begin, I would like to recognize Representative Stanton to say a few words about Mr. Santiago. Representative Stanton.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I am pleased to welcome to the subcommittee Larry Santiago, a native Arizonan, a first-generation American, and a former member of my congressional staff. Throughout his career as an immigration attorney, Mr. Santiago has fought to provide important legal services to individuals of all ages, including children, in immigration detention in Arizona, and has been recognized by his fellow practitioners for his exceptional advocacy. From 2017 to 2020, Mr. Santiago served as the chairman of the Community Advisory Board that was established by the federal court following a class action lawsuit against then Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio and his office for violating the constitutional rights of Latinos in Maricopa County in traffic enforcement decisions. As chairman of the Community Advisory Board, Mr. Santiago worked to foster an important and open dialogue between the community and the Sheriff's Office to improve mutual trust and respect. During his tenure, the board advanced some specific reforms and recommendations to improve how the Sheriff's Office interacts with the Latino community to ensure equal protection under the law in traffic enforcement. Thank you for being here, Mr. Santiago. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stanton. I'd now like to recognize Representative Brown to say a few words about Mr. Ray. Representative Brown.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for hosting or convening this very important hearing. I introduce Dr. Rashawn Ray, a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. A proud constituent of Maryland's 4th Congressional District, Dr. Ray is also a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland and the executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research. In 2016, Dr. Ray and his colleagues at the University of Maryland conducted research focused on the Prince George's County Police Department to understand differences in policing of individuals depending on their race, gender, or sexual orientation. That research is the foundation of a program developed to help police officers identify and address implicit and unconscious bias. The training program uses 3D virtual reality to immerse officers in various situations while stress levels are measured. Virtual reality training has been critical to providing officers a risk-free setting to understand their own biases and practice use of force and verbal de-escalation. It's important to note that in his research, Dr. Ray stresses that implicit bias training is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's because of the work that Dr. Ray has done at the University of Maryland that I introduced the Bias in Automobile Stops Act. This bill that I introduced was also included in HR 2, the Moving Forward Act, and it would establish a new discretionary grant program for institutions of higher education for research and training on implicit bias training programs as it relates to racial profiling at traffic stops. I look forward to hearing Dr. Ray's testimony. I believe the committee will find it very informative and valuable in our deliberations. And I look forward to continuing to work together with the committee, with Dr. Ray and his colleagues to better address implicit bias and racial profiling in policing. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Without objection, our witness's full statement will be included in the record. Since your full testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Let's begin with Mr. Santiago. You may proceed, sir.
Chairwoman, Ranking Member Davis, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today in my capacity as the former chairman of the Community Advisory Board in Melendez v. Arpaio, a federal case out of Maricopa County, Arizona. The Community Advisory Board was created by the court after it found that the sheriff's office had engaged in racial profiling and unlawful traffic stops of Latino drivers. Long before there was a trial or statistical data attesting to these facts, Latino families in Maricopa County knew that race, and not criminality, was the basis of traffic enforcement. If you were a Latino driver in Maricopa County, you were 4 to 9 times more likely to be pulled over by the sheriff's office. You were also more likely to be searched, detained, or arrested. This discriminatory practice applied to Latinos across the board, regardless of education, community stature, or citizenship. Under the guise of transportation safety, Sheriff Joe Arpaio was doing what he really wanted to do, which was immigration enforcement. Traffic stops became a pretext to investigate Latinos for immigration violations. It did not matter that the considerable majority of Latinos living in Maricopa County are in fact American citizens or here lawfully. These traffic stops evolved into a systematic and specialized traffic enforcement scheme known as saturation patrols. Sheriff's deputies would descend upon Latino neighborhoods or places where Latinos gathered, saturating the neighborhood, and would detain people based on alleged traffic concerns or equipment failures. This happened for years. No place seemed off limits. In one case, the sheriff's deputies conducted a raid at a church that was helping Latino workers. Their justification was that people were gathering on the side of the street and causing transportation safety concerns. At trial, this was found to be demonstrably not true, as the officer's notes said that the workers had been inside the church parking lot. Imagine the effect on a community when you are hunted at a house of worship, when seeking work is dangerous, when your neighborhood has been marked. Individual harm was compounded into community trauma. In a different case, officers boarded a school bus and threatened the children that they would deport their parents if they didn't behave. The fear was so intense that some of the children wet themselves. That kind of pain doesn't just go away. Behind every data point of a prolonged and unjustified stop is a real person with a story and a family. The named plaintiff in the case, Mr. Melendez, is a retired school teacher with 3 children. He was a passenger in a car and was taken to jail for hours. When he was finally let go, he wasn't cited or charged with anything. I spoke with him yesterday, and Mr. Melendez, like many others, talks about his experience in terms of shame and humiliation. His dignity had been run over. For children, the trauma was profound. For 9-year-old Catherine, it was seeing her father arrested on TV. For 10-year-old Heidi, it was having her mother taken away. But this isn't just a story of victimization. It's also a story of resilience. The community rose up, organized itself, and began to fight back. The fear of retaliation was real, but the strength of character to say basta or no more was even greater. The lawsuit was lengthy and complex, but in sum, the community won. The court found that the sheriff's policies and procedures institutionalized the illegal consideration of race as a factor in traffic enforcement practices. A few years after the court ruling, the community won again, this time at the ballot box, and Sheriff Joe was voted out of office. Among the many reforms that the court ordered was the creation of the Community Advisory Board, which facilitates dialogue between the community and the sheriff's office and advises on recommendations to increase community trust. When the new sheriff took office, I was jointly selected by him and the plaintiff's representatives to help with this effort. I'd like to highlight 2 court-ordered reforms that the community found particularly helpful. 1, The power of data, its collection, analysis, and publication soon became apparent. After the court ordered data reports, clear patterns emerged. Not only were Latinos being treated differently, but so were other communities of color. This data allowed the community to keep track of progress and offer specific recommendations for reform. As the data became more and more of what I call quote unquote community friendly, or easy to access and easy to understand, the community was able to provide more effective recommendations. The second reform that resonated with the community was the use of body-worn cameras. Community members consistently asked us about their use and policies. It was a reform that was easily understood, both in practice and in benefit. Although I am no longer the chairman of the Community Advisory Board, it continues the crucial work of rebuilding trust and ensuring equitable traffic enforcement and dignity for everyone. Thank you for your time, and I welcome your questions.
I thank the gentleman. Ms. Lorraine Martin.
Chairs DeFazio and Norton, ranking members Graves and Davis, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here today to testify. It's truly an honor to be here. The National Safety Council has been America's leading nonprofit safety advocate for over a century. Our mission is to save lives from the workplace to any place, and that includes the roads. Our roadways became more dangerous last year, even as the number of miles driven significantly decreased due to the pandemic. Preliminary NSC estimates show that the first 11 months of last year, 38,370 Americans died on our roads. This represents an outstanding 7% increase over the same period just a year prior. It also represents a tragic reversal in the pre-pandemic safety trends when our roads were becoming safer for our drivers. I refer to the subcommittee in my written statement for a state-by-state breakdown of these lives lost. But suffice it to say, those 38,370 Americans are your constituents. We can and must do better. As we work to improve safety, it's essential that we also address inequity in our nation's transportation system. Because too often, safety is the privilege of a few, not a right enjoyed equitably by all. The National Safety Council encourages the subcommittee to consider 4 points in any future legislation, most of which we are pleased to see included in the Moving Forward Act, which did pass the House last year. First, we need better demographic data for crashes and traffic stops, and for that data to be shared more quickly than it is now. This can be accomplished through increased funding for agencies like NHTSA. Second, we must consider alternatives to traditional enforcement. This can include adoption of safe system approaches with self-enforcing roads, automated enforcement, and community policing, among other strategies. Third, we believe Congress should expand Section 1906 grant program to ensure racial profiling does not occur in traffic law enforcement. Fair and equitable application of roadway safety laws is the only way to keep all users safe. And finally, community members must be involved in the development of traffic laws and safety programs, means for enforcement and roadway design to ensure that their needs are being met. There are several steps taken towards these goals in the reauthorization passed by the House last year. We look forward to supporting the reintroduction of this bill and working together to incorporate today's learnings. In closing, we applaud the subcommittee for holding today's hearing. This conversation is an important step towards achieving our shared goal, which is a transportation system that prioritizes safety equitably for all. NSC pledges to work alongside you to make this vision a reality. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Martin. Ms. Michelle Ramsey Hawkins.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair DeFazio, Chair Norton, Ranking Member Graves, Ranking Members Davis, Ranking Members of Subcommittee for the invitation. My name is Michelle Ramsey Hawkins, and I'm honored to be here on behalf of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, representing millions of victims and survivors. I'm a MAD volunteer from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I'm also a social worker at Idea Innovation Academy, where our students are primarily from low-income communities of color. 100% of our students go on to college, and a Black woman, a social worker, and a mother who has suffered a traumatic loss, I appreciate being heard. Fair and just enforcement is crucial, and it is also achievable. More than 10,000 people are killed every year in alcohol-related traffic crash, and hundreds of thousands more are injured. MAD will not rest until drug driving is a thing of the past. MAD works closely with law enforcement, supporting officers' efforts to make our roads safer. Without traffic safety enforcement and the dedication of police officers, traffic fatalities and injuries increase sharply. Not one, but two drunk drivers changed my family lives forever. On April 10, 2016, my children, 15-year-old Kaylee, 6-year-old Caden, and 4-year-old Samuel, and I attended a party at my son Caden's godfather's house. Before we left, one of the guests promised Samuel a ride on his motorbike the following weekend. Samuel was thrilled. As we drove along the dark highway, Caden and Samuel chatted away in the back seat, excited about being up past their bedtime. I was unaware that up ahead, a trash compactor fell out of the back seat of a pickup truck. The driver had previous DUI convictions. On this night, he was driving drunk yet again. He didn't even bother to stop to retrieve the trash compactor, which we later crashed into. I pulled to the side of the road, I called police, and then my parents, asking them to come pick up my kids while I waited for help. I wanted my kids to be safe. Meanwhile, two Good Samaritans set up orange safety triangles to divert traffic. I remember the boys wrestling in the grass. I remember asking my daughter to help her brothers, instructing the boys to hold hands and stand in the grass away from the road. 1 minute, my children and I were waiting. The next minute, I was lying on the ground, unable to move or see. I heard my daughter's cries, but I heard nothing from my sons. I knew they were gone. The drunk driver who plowed into the safety triangles struck a car that struck me before running off the road, slamming into my children and one of the Good Samaritans. In the ambulance, EMT, an old high school friend, tried to keep me from hearing that my boys had died on the scene. Kaylee learned of the terrible truth while watching the news from hospital bed. The crash left her with back injuries and nerve damage. None of us would ever be the same. The impact of the crash damaged my son's body so badly that I never got to hold them again. Samuel's face had to be reconstructed with clay for the funeral. While Sam never got his motorbike ride, the sheriff's department sent out a whole fleet for the funeral. Motorcycles could be seen for what seemed like miles. For that, I was grateful. For 2 years, I faced the man who killed my sons and injured 3 others walk free. For 2 years, I went to court and faced him. Finally, a judge sentenced him to 19 years in prison. The repeat drunk driver who dropped the trash compactor and set into motion the events of that night is already out of jail. It would be naive for my family to think that my family's race and the race of the offenders did not play a role in what happened after the crash. My children were Black boys, the offenders were white men. What if it was the other way around? Would I have been crucified in the media, accused of having my children in the street, of being a negligent mother and somehow responsible for their deaths? As a Black mother, this is what I endured during the worst moments of my life. What if I were white and the drunk drivers were Black? Would we have had to fight so hard for so-called justice? Would I have felt the need to explain to the world that my beautiful boys were not just nameless statistics, but somebody, that Caden was a championship player who excelled academically, and that Sam loved painting, and if you got a picture from him, you got a Picasso. 2 boys who saw no race, and everyone was their cousin. Would I have felt the need to explain that their father is a staff sergeant who is currently serving in the army in Afghanistan, or that their uncle was the first Black district attorney for the city of Clinton, Louisiana? I shouldn't have to prove why my Black sons mattered or how it feels to live daily with inequity. My family had the resources to work in the justice system. We also had the support of MAD. MAD Victim Service Specialist Ms. Valerie Cox stood with us at every court appearance. I think about other families from community of colors who may not have had the resources we had. How would the system have treated them? What resources would they have had at their disposal? Max understands my pain, not only as a mother who lost her sons to drunk drivers, but as a mother of color who had to fight extra hard for some justice. Matt understands that traffic safety enforcement is critical to keep drunk drivers off the road. Matt commends this committee for its support of highly visibility enforcement. MET also continues to support law enforcement in their efforts to deter what would be drunk drivers. Simultaneously, MET recognizes the need for efforts to ensure enforcement is fair and just, and it must be paramount. We know that there is racial and ethnic disparities in traffic stops, and MET commends this committee for its efforts to address these disparities. Fair and just enforcement is achievable. Data is now being used to identify problems and solutions. Implicit bias is now part of dialogue. We all carry biases, knowingly or not, regardless of our race and ethnicity. We are also positioned today to eliminate drunk driving using technology. While fair and just traffic safety enforcement remains vital, advanced drunk driving prevention technology also exists, and this technology has no bias. MET is grateful for the committee for including language in HR 2 last year that calls for this technology to stand equipped on all new vehicles. The promise of a day with drunk driving is
Ms. Hawkins, if you could summarize soon.
No problem. On behalf of drunk driving victims, on behalf of my boys, allow me to leave you with two simple messages. First, fair and just traffic safety enforcement is essential in every community across this nation. Second, drunk driving prevention technology must be adapted as rapidly as possible. And third, always remember victims and survivors. Thank you.
Thank you for the testimony. I know it's not easy to talk about such a tragedy, so thank you. Mr. Ken Barone.
Good morning. Chair DeFazio, Chair Norton, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Ken Barone, and I'm the manager of the State of Connecticut's Racial Profiling Prohibition Project. My testimony today will focus on the benefits that the Section 1906 Racial Profiling Prohibition Grant Program has had on Connecticut's ability to address both equity and safety in traffic enforcement, and the value of expanding the funding to allow for even greater progress in eliminating racial profiling in traffic enforcement while also working to improve the safety of our roadways. Traffic stops are the most common encounter between law enforcement and the public. Understanding these routine interactions requires states to move beyond anecdotal conversations and to develop robust data collection and analysis programs. Connecticut first enacted an anti-racial profiling law in 1999. However, until resources were provided through the 1906 program, Connecticut struggled to properly implement the law. With the support of the 1906 grant program, we have developed a state-of-the-art data collection and analysis system. To date, we have collected over 91 million data points from more than 3.5 million traffic stops. Beyond simply collecting data, we have also conducted meaningful statewide and departmental analysis over the last 6 years. Our analysis is designed to identify both statewide trends and those departments with the most significant racial and ethnic disparities. Rather than treating the analysis as evidence of wrongdoing, we utilize the analysis as an early intervention system. This approach allows us to focus our limited resources on those departments that have the most significant racial and ethnic disparities. Departmental interventions are designed to be a collaboration between researchers, the law enforcement agency, and community stakeholders. These departmental interventions have produced important, actionable findings that departments have used to enact positive change. Since 2015, Connecticut's statewide analysis has consistently identified some of the following trends. Black and Hispanic drivers are disproportionately stopped and disproportionately searched when compared to white drivers. Police are significantly less likely to find contraband resulting from a search involving a Black or Hispanic driver. Black and Hispanic drivers are stopped at a greater rate for equipment violations and other administrative offenses when compared to white drivers. However, there is little evidence to support a claim that Black and Hispanic drivers more frequently commit these offenses. Racial and ethnic disparities Our significantly enforcement is primarily focused on hazardous driving behaviors. Although the primary motivation behind our work has been to identify and address racial and ethnic disparities in traffic enforcement, an added benefit to the program has been the accumulation of a rich data set that can inform researchers, practitioners, and transportation and law enforcement administrators about the enforcement techniques that are most effective in improving roadway safety. I want to be very clear. Our program has consistently shown that it is possible to eliminate racial and ethnic disparities in traffic enforcement and improve roadway safety at the same time. The 1906 program has been critical to our success in Connecticut. It has allowed our state to dive headfirst into an emotional and often traumatic conversation and create meaningful and measurable reform by positively addressing both equity and safety in traffic enforcement, all with stakeholders at the helm. We're proud that in recent years, our approach has been replicated in at least 3 other states, including California, Oregon, and Rhode Island. I'd be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to mention the important role that state departments of transportation play in administering this grant program. We are grateful for the continued support of the Connecticut Department of Transportation. In closing, I ask that you strongly consider the reauthorization and expansion of the 1906 program so that Connecticut and other states can continue to make progress on racial equity in traffic enforcement. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barone. In fact, your program is of special interest to me since my bill established the 1906 program. I want to call on the last witness, Dr. Rashawn Ray, Professor of Sociology, University of Maryland. Dr. Ray.
Chair Norton, Chair DeFazio, Vice Chair Davis, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity. We've heard a lot about the disparities that exist in traffic stops. I want to talk about our virtual reality program to improve equity and objectivity in policing at traffic stops. As you see here, here's an image of an officer in our lab. We put officers in a virtual reality environment where they encounter the sort of scenarios that they do every single day. Traffic stops, but other types of programs. We have 4 major objectives: to improve decision-making and reduce bias, evaluate how stress, sleep, and travel affect judgment and behavior. These are factors that are oftentimes underemphasized, but our research in the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland suggests that they matter quite a bit. Provide tools and metrics to improve interpersonal dynamics and cross-cultural awareness, and then offer recommendations from our research that can reduce conflict and misunderstanding. We've developed over 100 virtual reality scenarios, suspicious person scenes, domestic scenes, robbery scenes, but I'm going to double down on focusing on pullover scenes and traffic stops for the purposes of this hearing. Officers encounter people that vary by race, by gender, by language. We went out with law enforcement in the state of Maryland. You can see here officers showing us where they stand. You see a police car in the back as if you pull someone over. You see that there's traffic going by on a busy street, really mimicking the sort of scenarios that they go through. When officers go into the VR and they pull someone over, they're given a series of prompts. Those prompts ask them, do they want to run a driver's license? If they say yes, they see a series of additional prompts talking about, do you want to dismiss the driver with a warning? Do you want to give a citation? Do you want to investigate further? When they investigate further, they're able to look into the vehicle. They find some marijuana residue. And then they are asked what they want to do again. You can see on the left that they encounter individuals of different racial backgrounds. We do the same thing for gender and language as well. They wear the same thing. You see an officer at the bottom going through it. And we collect a host of information, not only their behavior and their decision making, but also the participants' physiological outcomes, which I'll say something about in a second, their attitudes, their demographics, the virtual reality actor demographics, and then the setting. Are they in a rural area, in an urban area? Is it busy or is it not? As you see here, we are taking officers through the virtual reality. You see a series of metrics that I'll talk about in a second that allow us to get beyond just the way we might think about the way that police officers behave and actually explain why they're behaving the way they do. So time. So the way that officers are actually responding in the moment, we put little sensors on replica weapons. We outfit them to specific departments. We know when officers pull their weapon, when they shoot the trigger, when they put it back in their holster. You can see the data blown up on the right side. We can also track their eyes. We know exactly where they're looking at. Anyone who's a law enforcement officer knows that when they approach a vehicle, they're looking in the vehicle, they're looking behind it. There's research suggesting that they're more likely to look in the vehicle for certain people, less likely for others. This becomes an important training tool. We can also examine police officers' heart rates. We put heart rate monitors on them. We can examine their heart rate, as you see in this example. Officer CP starts out interacting with someone. Heart rate is on the y-axis on the left. The seconds is on the bottom. As he starts talking, his heart rate increases because what the person is doing in this particular scenario has led to that increase, and that could also impact the officer's judgment. We are able to compare some of these outcomes. So for example, we could compare less experienced officers to more experienced officers. More experienced officers tend to be more stable, less stress, similar heart rates throughout, helping them to make better decisions. We can also examine their stress through speech. We put their audio through a voice machine, and that tells us how stressed officers might be. And then finally, we give officers a police report to fill out. But look, instead of me just telling you this, I think one of the best things to do is to show you. What you're going to see is a brief demo showing you what it looks like when officers go through the virtual reality program. You'll see an officer first going through what it looks like in our lab, and then also something that's extremely innovative, which is how we move beyond just working with officers in a lab to help local police departments end up being able to interact with people in person in a setting, say with high school students in a school. So as we're pulling this up, part of what you'll see is the officer reacting. You won't be able to hear it, I'll narrate it through, but you'll be able to see the officer reacting in that moment with the goggles on. This is an officer from the Midwest. You can see that he's talking to someone, that he's telling someone to move, he's giving directions. So they are fully immersed in a 360-degree environment. But as I said, one of the biggest innovations as well is not just our ability to take the data, but to work with local communities to improve police-community relationships. We go into schools, work with local police departments. You see this officer here with a traffic stop. We bring up an officer and students up at the same exact time. They go through the same scenario. You see the officer interacting with the person on the screen. You see he's having a conversation with her. You'll see in a second additional prompts pop up. And part of what it's doing is asking the same questions that I just showed you on the graph about what decisions that he wants to make. Does he want to run the license? He runs the license. It comes back suspended. He's asked to do additional things. What this officer chose to do was to allow someone to come and get the driver and also get the vehicle if they have a valid driver's license. Other officers might choose to make different decisions. We then break students up in groups with police officers and community members to have conversations about what's going on. One of the most powerful things was a student who said that he had never had a normal conversation with a police officer before that day. Our program is not only built to go across the country, which we've done in some regards, but it also helps to improve police community relations. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. That was, to hear those innovations was very enlightening. We will proceed to questions now. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Barone, I mentioned your program in my own opening remarks. I championed Section 1906, and so I'd like to hear more about how it is operated and why it has been successful in Connecticut against racial profiling. Apparently, you simply didn't treat your findings as evidence of wrongdoing. That's where you began. What are some of the outcomes you've been able to achieve in Connecticut to address racial disparities in traffic stops using this approach? No wrongdoing instead of the Connecticut, using the Connecticut approach.
Thank you for the question, Chair Norton, and thank you for your continued support. Has largely been the result of two factors. One is a statewide creation of an advisory board of stakeholders that have met monthly for the better part of 8 years to try and tackle this issue. The second thing that has led to the success of this program are departmental interventions. We've often seen across the country researchers come in, do a statewide study, and simply point the finger at police agencies, tell them they have a problem, and not help them figure out what's driving that problem, or help them determine what solutions they can implement to address that problem. And so we felt that it was our obligation as researchers not to simply point the finger at law enforcement and walk away. So we spend our time now identifying agencies that require our attention. We go in and we work with those agencies along with community stakeholders to try and better understand what are the factors driving disparities. I'll give you one example to put a finer point on it. We had an agency in Connecticut that had a significant racial disparity being driven by their use of low-level lighting enforcement. They made 1,608 traffic stops in a 12-month time period for defective lighting. And they had articulated that it was part of their roving DUI patrol. They were looking for drunk drivers without ever having realized that out of the 1,608 stops for low-level lighting violations, they had only identified one drunk driver. But in fact, they were much more successful at identifying drunk drivers when they used techniques that didn't have racial and ethnic disparities in the outcomes and were more likely to identify drunk drivers like certain hazardous moving violations. That level of analysis, those levels of conversation, and that level of intervention in that case is what has led to reforms in that agencies. We've been fortunate to do 28 departmental interventions out of 107 agencies in the state of Connecticut. And we've made findings in all 28 agencies and helped all 28 agencies improve the outcomes of their stops as a result of those interventions and us staying at the table with stakeholders throughout the process.
Mr. Barone, I'd like to know whether or not other states have been able to replicate the model you've achieved in Connecticut and with the same level of success. And I'd like to know about how much funding. Do you believe you could do more with additional federal investment, or is funding just not an issue here? Could you answer those two questions?
Yes, so currently 3 states have replicated to some version the Connecticut model: Rhode Island, California, and Oregon, all to great success. The same type of approach: stakeholders, research, departmental intervention. The reality is that the funding is not nearly enough. Every state receives, that applies for this funding, receives $375,000 grant a year. In these challenging fiscal times, previously in Connecticut, for example, we were fortunate to have funding offset by state money, which in recent years has dried up. And obviously in larger states like California and Oregon, that's challenging as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Barone. And your testimony that it has been replicated suggests to me that this committee would want to do more to see that it's replicated, and you say 3 states and even more states. So I very much appreciate that testimony regarding this innovation, and would like to now yield to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the opportunity to hear from our witnesses. Mr. Sandiego, as a former district staffer yourself, and a former district staffer to Mr. Stanton, being a former district staffer myself, I understand the impact you would have had working with him, and I wish you the best in your new position. Miss Ramsey Hawkins, what a tragic story for you and your family. And I'm just glad you're able to share it with us today. Especially, that's personal for me. I was hit by a drunk driver when I was 12. My ex-brother-in-law and I found out that a Lincoln Continental in the early 80s far outweighs a Ford Maverick in the early 80s. And we learned the hard way, but we were both lucky enough to survive. And it's interesting, times have changed. based upon a lot of the investments that have been made into programs that NHTSA is in charge of, that would change the enforcement of drunk driving back in 1982. And because of the advocacy of groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, we're in a much different position to ensure that everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, or any other possible bias, are going to face the consequences for their actions. And it's because of organizations like yours and advocates like you that continues. We need to continue to fund NHTSA programs that are obviously working. But my questions go to Ms. Martin. And again, Ms. Martin, great to talk with you yesterday. Thanks for the time today. One of the items you touched on in your testimony is drug-impaired driving. Can you elaborate on the concerns of the National Safety Council when it comes to drugged driving?
Yes, thank you for that question. You know, today nearly 30 people die on our roadways from crashes related to alcohol impaired driving. But we also know that alcohol isn't the only impairment that an individual driver might be under. Things such as fatigue, distraction, as we heard out in the opening comments, and also more recently, marijuana. So anything that has a human being not being on par driving should be of our concern. 28% of all people who die in crashes were involved in some kind of alcohol-related activity. So we do know this is one of the most important things that we can double down on, making sure that drivers are not impaired. We heard in the testimony about technology that's available to be put in cars to ensure that drivers are not drunk. I will share, though, with marijuana, it's a new challenge for us because we need new technologies to be able to understand whether somebody is impaired at that time as more and more states legalize or decriminalize marijuana.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up. That leads me to my next question. I'm from Illinois. Illinois legalized recreational marijuana. I support states being able to do that. My legislature in Illinois decided that was the new law of the land, but we have to make sure that we do the research necessary to keep our roadways safe. Now, you mentioned to me yesterday some of the concerns that are being brought forth in regards to how to develop a test that could possibly put THC levels in, but you also mentioned some concerns about that being the barometer. Can you expand on this for the subcommittee?
Yeah, thank you, sir. So today we know in alcohol, we can do a blood alcohol level, and states have their regulations around that have been very effective to have a car side or other kinds of interventions to understand how much alcohol is in someone's system. For THC or cannabis, it's a little more challenging. We don't have that technology today that roadside could say definitively that the amount of drug in your system is causing a certain level of impairment. People are working on it, but in the meantime, one of the technologies or techniques that are used to ensure that we understand the impairment of an individual is called a drug recognition expert. And these are law enforcement individuals who are impairment, regardless of doing anything with actual substance in the body. So that's really important that we not only have those training programs, we increase funding for those training programs and make sure that we have them across our nation.
Well, thank you very much for helping to explain that issue too. Last question. If this committee decides to address the issues of bias and equity by prohibiting states from using NHTSA grant funds for enforcement activity, what effect will that have on roadway safety?
You know, the National Safety Council is very supportive of law enforcement and all kinds of enforcement related programs. And the NHTSA grant programs have been critical to that. So we definitely encourage that those programs be remained in place and that they be focused on the techniques and the remediations that we know really truly can have more safety on our roads. And we would encourage in law enforcement alternatives to be part of that program.
Thank you, and thank you again to all the witnesses. Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I recognize now Ms. Johnson of Texas.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the fact that we have great witnesses, and let me thank them, and also thank you for the hearing. I'd like to, and I also like to ask unanimous consent to put my opening statement in the record. Ms. Martin.
Ordered.
I understand that the National Safety Council is America's leading nonprofit safety advocate and has been so for over 100 years. you documented that people of color are disproportionately represented in fatal crashes involving people walking. For the record, what do you attribute these disproportionately high numbers of people of color being killed by a vehicle while walking?
Yeah, it's a very important question, ma'am, and thank you. You know, in a lot of communities that people of color are in, we don't have the same kind of safeguards in our roadways. We may not have sidewalks, and if communities and residents are using their roadway environment to walk or bicycle or use pedestrian-related approaches to get where they need to be for their job, for their healthcare, for whatever they need, they are at higher risk. Some of the data has also shown, unfortunately, that drivers don't yield as much to persons of color, which is just startling and alarming. And then again, data sets us free, as we heard from Connecticut, understanding what is really going on and then taking actions. But not all roads are created equal. And we need to look in the communities where we are seeing higher fatalities and injuries and look at how the roads and roadway infrastructure is being used and ensure we put the investment where we know we have the highest risk factors.
Thank you very much. Mr. Barone, I'd like to add, in your testimony, you stated that disparities in the criminal justice system, particularly police enforcement, there's been a major source of political protests and social unrest in the United States. Motor vehicle enforcement is a common focus of these conversations since it is the public's most frequent interaction with law enforcement. What role does the collection of data play in equity and transportation safety enforcement and combating racial profiling?
Thank you for the question, Representative. I can tell you that in the absence of data, we've been having these conversations anecdotally, and people have come forward with their experiences, which are important to share and powerful, but they've often been refuted by law enforcement. And once the whole cold, hard facts are presented, we can finally advance the conversation, not to whether the problem exists, but what do we do about the problem? And when we started this work, for example, in Connecticut, we were still arguing over whether we had a problem. And once we finally collected the data, we could go and say, we can't be arguing anymore about whether this exists. Those stories that people have been presenting, that they've been sharing over recent years, they need to be believed because the data supports them, which is why it's critical that we collect this information moving forward.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Sandego, is it your professional opinion and experience that race-based enforcement of traffic safety laws actually impedes transportation safety?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. Absolutely. I think that the distrust that happens when a community is subject to race-based enforcement can affect any interaction with future law enforcement. For example, Latino members of the community were hesitant to come forward as witnesses if they had seen something on the road. They did not want to interact with the sheriff's deputies because of what that could lead to. Same thing that if they were victims of a crime, they would not want to interact with the sheriff's deputies. And so the breaking of the bond between law enforcement and the community affected future interactions, and it also created distrust for surrounding equivalents because it was used consistently against the community to pull them over.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think my time's about expired.
Thank you very much, Ms. Johnson. Now going to Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. And I want to thank the panelists who have offered, all of them, some compelling information for us to consider. But I couldn't help notice the relative scarcity of information we have available to us today related to Native Americans and people in tribal areas. Of course, I want to start by calling out some good behavior. Madam Chair, you mentioned tribal governments in your opening remarks, and thank you for that. Mr. Davis, ranking member, noted Secretary Designate Haaland, and our willingness to work with her. And of course, she knows well the issues facing Indian country. And then I do want to call out Ms. Martin, who I was grateful to see on page 3 of her testimony referenced some data having to do with Native American fatalities. It was the only reference to Native Americans or American Indians in the 40 or 50 or 60 pages of testimony before us. And I thought it was important data for her to bring forward. I want to dive into these issues a bit more because so many of my friends who are American Indians have told me so many times that they feel invisible, even when we're talking about policy issues related to people of color. They feel as though their issues are overlooked. And so I do want us as a committee, as a subcommittee, to dive a little deeper today during my time. And of course, we know that this is a real issue. I would offer 3 data points to set the stage. First off, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration notes that there were 2,958 motor crash fatalities among American Indians just in the years 2015 to 2019. Secondly, I would note that in Ms. Martin's testimony, which I referenced earlier, she notes that Native American pedestrians are almost three times more likely to be killed than or to be involved in a fatal crash than white Americans. And then I would commend to all of you the 2018 report Secretary Chow did and submitted to Congress on options for improving transportation safety in tribal areas. It's an excellent read. It well defines opportunities for us as Congress, as well as others, to make meaningful progress in this area. The beginning of her report notes that in some states, Native Americans are overrepresented in fatal crashes by as much as 4 times the general population. That's chilling statistics in my mind, I'm sure for many of my colleagues as well. And I want to use a specific example from South Dakota that I think might help some of my colleagues who don't have Indian country within their district understand the challenges that American Indians face in this arena. So let me talk about the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which is served by the Oglala Sioux Tribal Police. And these statistics are eye-opening. I mean, first off, this is the second busiest law enforcement agency in Indian country in the United States of America, second only to the Navajo Nation. It is, by my estimation, the second busiest law enforcement agency in the state of South Dakota. We're talking about their dispatch receiving 139,000 calls last year, which resulted in over 72,000 calls for service and 9,000 arrests last year. I think we all probably understand that those numbers were down because of COVID, but still astronomically high. And we're talking about 2.5 million acres under the jurisdiction of this law enforcement agency. They have 43 sworn officers to cover 2.5 million miles. So, why do I bring this up? What does this all mean? I mean, we are going to be dealing with law enforcement reform in the 117th Congress. We are going to be dealing in the broader committee with the 5-year reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Bill. These are critically important pieces of legislation that have a tremendous impact on the lives of people, of course, across America, but particularly within Indian country. And so I just want to make sure that we do not overlook the lives of American Indians or those living in tribal areas when we're dealing with these huge pieces of legislation. And with the few seconds I have left, Madam Chair, I would just note one additional resource for my colleagues. Last year in August, I sent a letter to Speaker Pelosi and to Leader McCarthy that outlined some investments that we in Congress can make to address these law enforcement and transportation safety issues in Indian country. I would ask for unanimous consent to have it entered into the record of today's proceeding. And I believe I have a physical copy there in the room, ma'am. And with that, I would yield back and thank you.
So ordered. Mr. Johnson, I appreciate those statistics. I mean, people are far more familiar with the statistics involving African Americans. I had never heard the statistics you've just given us on Native Americans. I imagine that the way in which we're able to understand what is happening to Native Americans is that these stops occur in areas which are Native American areas, and I think they demand the kind of attention that I think your questions have raised for the subcommittee and the full committee.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, sir. I'd like to recommend, I'd like to recognize Mr. Cyrus at this time. Mr. Cyrus, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Norton, and thank you to all our witnesses today. I believe addressing equity in the traffic safety and enforcement space is very important, especially since almost 70% of my district speaks a language other than English at home. 60% identify as Spanish speaking. As a Cuban American in Congress, I believe it is my duty to use my voice to help shine a light on and combat systemic racism and explicit biases across the country and within our transportation sector. Mr. Sandigo, first I want to thank you for sharing the stories of immigrants in this country. I think it is important for members of Congress and the public to hear about what immigrants, family, and minority community experience in America, and how these experiences are not unique, but commonplace in this country. My question is to you, Mr. Sandigo. As a former chairman of the Community Advisory Board, can you elaborate on the specific reforms that were implemented and have proven to be most effective in increasing community trust?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. The use and publication of data was key for the community to understand what was happening. If you don't know what's happening, it's easy to pretend that nothing bad is going on. And so the data related not just to things like traffic stops, traffic length, arrests and seizures, but also things, for example, if someone filed a misconduct complaint, how long would it take to be resolved? What was the process that the deputy went through? And so that information was critical for the community to understand. And something that we really pressed the sheriff's office on was making the information accessible. So one was making this information available in Spanish and to have Spanish speakers be able to explain it, and in terms that were easily understood so that they didn't get caught up in the jargon or in something that wasn't understandable to them.
What else can we do? What more can we do?
I think as I mentioned in my testimony, body-worn cameras were really effective in increasing community trust. It was something that community members had heard about. It was something that they were interested in learning how it worked, what were the policies behind it. And it was something that they also had strong opinions on. So for example, if it came out that a sheriff's deputy had muted the camera because they were talking strategy, community members, it would look at that as, what do you mean they get to mute it when they talk strategy? What are the policies and parameters around that? And so once they understood something like that, they would be able to engage in a more a higher level conversation. I think also just the presence of a community advisory board that was independent. We did not report to the sheriff. We were not under his jurisdiction, allowed there to be a level of trust that we could channel their concerns up to the right people.
Thank you. Dr. Ray, are you there, Dr. Ray?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Yeah. I'm interested in hearing more about data gather from this virtual reality. One of the things that I noticed, and having been a former mayor, is that sometimes police officers reacted when they made a stop. If somebody had a heavy accent or somebody didn't speak the proper English, it seemed that their reaction immediately turned a little bit hostile. In some cases, not all cases. I don't want to, put everybody in the same mold, but there were many times where you almost can see it. Is there a way in your studies that you can detect that?
Yes, sir, it definitely is. So one of the things that we do, we not only vary the race or gender of the person, but also their perceived ethnicity. We tested their faces with raters, and we also include language, a series of languages that we thought consciously about that are some of the most pervasive in the United States: Spanish, French, Middle Eastern, Mandarin, and Caribbean in terms of accents and words used. So in that regard, we are actually able to assess that when an officer interacts with someone, how do they respond to a person's accent? One of the biggest things we found is that when it's an accent or it's difficult for someone to understand, it oftentimes enhances stress. And so how can we help to reduce that stress, to reduce bias?
Thank you very much. My time is up, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cyrus. Next, Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Santiago, in your testimony, you speak of the use of body-worn cameras. I believe that this is something that is very important for our law enforcement to be equipped with body-worn cameras. And I think it's important that we make these body-worn cameras available to all law enforcement, particularly those serving in rural jurisdictions. We know that many large communities, such as your county, may be able to fund body cams, but there are smaller jurisdictions, cities and towns that are unable to afford this technology. A lot of concerns come from these smaller constituents that are unable to compete for some of the federal grant funding that is available for body-worn cameras. Many of these grants going toward more larger urban cities than toward our rural police departments. And this could lead to inequity and issues as far as the technology that's possessed by large urban police departments and then more smaller rural departments. And so my question is, can you speak to the benefit of all law enforcement units having broader access to the most up-to-date body cameras and equipments to best create transparency in law enforcement, and how this relates to those issues that we're discussing today?
Congressman, thank you for the question. What I can speak to is how it benefited us in Maricopa County. Maricopa County has urban areas such as Phoenix, but it also has rural areas on the outer edges of the county. And both in the urban areas and in the rural areas, the use of body-worn cameras, the knowledge that the community had that those were, the deputies had them and that they were using them. And we even asked, like, can you bring one to a community meeting? Can you show us how it turns on, how it turns off? What are the, parameters around it? Proved to be successful in increasing community trust. And so both in the urban and rural parts of Maricopa County, it was a helpful policy.
And would you agree that the use of body-worn cameras protects the general public from law enforcement who may be physically or verbally abusive, but also, on the other hand, it protects law enforcement from people who may make claims against law enforcement that are unsubstantiated?
In my experience, both the deputies and the community members liked the body-worn camera policy. For example, if there was a misconduct complaint against a particular officer, then it was easy to look over that particular footage of that particular officer to see what had actually happened. And so it went both ways in terms of perceived benefit.
And Ms. Hawkins, wanted to first thank you for being here. I've read your testimony. I heard your opening statement. I want to tell you how sorry we are for the loss of your two sons that were killed by a drunk driver. I see here that in this information, it looks like that both individuals that were involved were prosecuted. I see one has already been released from custody.
and another is serving a prison sentence of 19 years in the custody of, I'm assuming, the Louisiana Department of Corrections. And I also want to commend you on being a part of MAD. Mothers of Against Drunk Drivers is a phenomenal organization. As a former prosecutor, I know that MAD serves an important role between the prosecutor's office and law enforcement and the victims. But in looking at this, my question to you is, what should we be doing to be more aggressive in our efforts to remove drunk drivers from our streets? I know you talk a little bit about some of the high visibility enforcement, sobriety checkpoints, saturation patrols. We talk a little bit in your testimony about the use of technology in both passive and active technology that would be able to detect impairment. And so my question to you is, what should law enforcement be doing to be more aggressive? And then finally, my follow-up question to that is, do you think that we should increase penalties for those convicted of drinking and driving? In many states, my state of Mississippi, assuming that no one is injured, before a DUI becomes a felony, you have to have 2 prior DUI convictions within 5 years. And so I think it is important that we look at seeing what we can do to increase those penalties. But I wanted to ask your opinion on both what we should do to be more aggressive, and if you think there needs to be a push by Congress to increase the penalties for those convicted of drinking and driving.
Okay. Thank you for your questions and this opportunity. First, we have to definitely start having these conversations. We all have to come together at the table and come find that common ground. We talked today about 2 excellent programs that states and bring that data. We have to bridge together everything that everyone has. And we definitely need to increase the penalties that are happening for drunk driving. That's just, my personal opinion on that, giving my own personal experience. But it starts with communities coming together, and it takes people like myself, the professors that are implementing these programs, which are excellent programs that we stand behind at MAD and support. And we got to have those conversations. And it starts with just talking, bringing together communities, law enforcement, and pushing these programs. It has to happen. And so once we getting these things going, bring it back to the table, everyone brings what we have to offer, bring it out to the community, and that's where we go.
Thank you. And Madam Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I particularly thank him for his question on body-worn cameras. I've had a bill in for some time to have federal officers also wear body-worn cameras. They are ubiquitous in the states. There's no reason why the federal officers should not also have such cameras. Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. And I thank all who have testified today and sharing their expertise. I wanted to ask Mr. Barron a question. You said in your testimony that only 23 states had applied for the Section 1906 funding. And that's not all the states. Are the states that have not applied, are they resistant to collecting such data, or are there other reasons why these states are not applying for these funds?
So we know that there are over 30 states that require some form of data collection with regards to information on traffic stops. And in my experience in talking to a number of states and in talking to a number of organizations like the Council of State Governments, which has networks in all the states, one of the reasons why states have not always taken advantage of the 1906 program is largely because of a lack of knowledge and a bit of a disconnect. The 1906 program resides in the highway safety offices, typically in state departments of transportation, and oftentimes the work that's being done in states to address racial disparities in policing is being done by some criminal justice entity. So there's been a bit of a disconnect, and I believe that that this program would benefit from a technical advisor like many DOJ grant programs are established, so that some entity can come in and help NHTSA get the word out that these funds are available, and to help states that A, already collect this data, utilize this funding to enhance their program, and B, to reach out to states that aren't currently collecting data to build this infrastructure. And again, I just think that bringing in some technical advisor to help NHTSA on that would go a long way in getting more states to know about the money, to use the money, and to partner the transportation folks with the criminal justice folks.
Thanks for that. And I noticed that, California is one of the states that has replicated your model, but they are also one of the states that haven't applied for the 1906 funds. Do you have any idea why California is not doing it? Do they fall into the trap that you just described?
So I've been fortunate enough to have done some work in California as they helped to get their program up and running and their law passed in 2015. And the reality is, I think it's what I mentioned earlier, which is that $375,000 a year in California, right, just doesn't go that far. And then you've got to talk about all the work that goes into applying for and oversight of receiving and spending the federal dollars. It's just a challenge in California. I can't speak for them, but they may have made a calculation that, they have, over 400 police agencies in California that are going to be collecting data. And so it's a much different challenge than, say, we had in Connecticut, where there's 100 agencies and we're a smaller state. And it's one of the reasons why I'd advocate for additional resources to be spent that states could have access to really ensure that resources are provided through this program.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Ray, I had a question for you. And I've heard you testify before, so I think what you do is extraordinarily important in terms of the training aspect. So in your research, have you studied whether the race of a law enforcement officer has any impact on racial bias in enforcement?
Yes, thank you for that question. The race of the officer doesn't matter as much as we might expect. And what I mean by that is, what we do is we're able to examine comprehensively officers' implicit attitudes and their explicit attitudes. And what we find that regardless of race, that officers are more likely to exhibit a form of bias against Black drivers and Black pedestrians. And I think that's something that's really, really important. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't see a gap in implicit attitudes in terms of Black officers in particular being less likely to hold those attitudes. But when it plays out in the scenarios, there are a series of factors that race also intersects with. For example, stress level, sleep, whether or not they're hungry, their judgment. And those factors oftentimes can lead to racial bias going on steroids. So we put officers through these programs. They repeatedly go through, they get feedback from training officers to reduce the likelihood of bias and reduce objectivity when they're encountering someone in the field.
And would you say the gender or the age of a police officer still doesn't have any measurable impact?
So age is interesting because it relates oftentimes to experience. Now, that doesn't always mean that we don't have older officers who are less experienced, but age and experience are highly correlated. We find that more experienced officers are much more stable when they interact with people, meaning more stable heart rates, more stable stress levels, and they tend to make better decisions. Gender is similar to race. When we actually look at our scenarios and we're able, and let me be clear, we are one of the first entities to be able to really examine attitudes and behavior. There are some that examine attitudes. There are some that just measure behavior. We're able to do both. And when we put that together, we don't see as huge of an impact when it comes to gender, say women officers interacting with people relative to men. Instead, what we found more broadly in our research is that race and gender matter also within police departments for promotion and equitable policies that then spills over into the streets that leads to better decision making.
Thank you so much, and I yield back my time, Madam Chair.
I thank Ms. Brownlee for her questions. I must say I was astounded to hear that there's no difference between Black drivers and in respect to these stops. So that tells us that we shouldn't simply assume where race stands here. I found that astonishing to hear that those stops on the part of Black officers appear as often as on the part of white officers. This is the kind of testimony we need when we decide what to do, so we don't take race into account where it's not relevant. Mr. Niels, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio and Ms. Norton. I'm glad that we're having this conversation today. And as a former lawman for 30 years, I thought I might be able to share some of my experiences. But before I get into it, I would like to personally thank the thousands of law enforcement officers that are serving our communities across this great country of ours each and every day under the difficult conditions. And that includes the Capitol Hill Police. So my hat's off to those that chose law enforcement as a career. I served as sheriff of Fort Bend County from January 2013 to 2020 for 8 years. And during those 8 years, I submitted a report on racial profiling to the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement. It was done each and every year. Those reports are public, and anyone can look at them. Every law enforcement agency in Texas that can pull someone over is required to submit that report. And I know Texas is not alone in requiring agencies to collect and publish that data. Fort Bend is a great county. It is the most diverse county in the entire country. That's according to the Rice University's Kinder Institute, a very respected institution. In 2019, the Fort Bend County Sheriff's Office conducted 22,990 stops. The 22,990 stops, and we had zero instances of any bodily injury, either to the deputy or the violator. And I'm very proud of that figure. Now, I'm no statistician like Mr. Barone, but it was my observation as sheriff that in predominantly white parts of the county, traffic stops tended to be white. In predominantly Hispanic parts, they tended to be Hispanic. That data is available, and feel free to run regressions on that. It seems to me that if agencies are collecting and publishing data, it should be the Department of Justice that looks at it, not NHTSA. If a law enforcement agency is clearly demonstrating racial profiling in its data, the DOJ can enter a consent decrees to improve policing. And there are 13 agencies investigations which are open today. The DOJ should probably be the one who helps states start collecting the data too. I will echo the comments of my colleagues and say that we are probably not the committee. We're not the committee in the House best equipped to examine and debate this topic. NHTSA does great work on highway safety programs, and you have to really think about the word safety. That's what their mission is. My deputies use NHTSA training on child passenger safety to help the parents in Fort Bend County. And believe it or not, that program, it saves lives, and I support it. It's been a wonderful program. I just don't see the utility in diverting funds from safety programs to study things that should be the focus of other federal agencies. I mean, let's keep collecting the data, and let's use it to improve law enforcement. But let's make sure that the right tool and agencies are being applied. With that being said, I have a question for Mr. Barone, and I'm glad to, sir, to see your success with Connecticut had with 1906. But do you believe the Federal Department of Transportation is better equipped than the DOJ, the Department of Justice, to work with law enforcement agencies as it relates to racial profiling or racial bias?
Thank you for the question, Representative. I can tell you that the 1906 program has been used to help states grapple with this issue themselves, and that the Department of Justice, in the case of Connecticut, there's oftentimes when we've taken our data and gone to the Department of Justice and asked them to review things. But the federal agency, NHTSA, doesn't play a role in the evaluating or in the establishment of the system that collects and analyzes data. It's designed so that states can best create the programs that work best for them and their localities. And so there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. The approach we take in Connecticut, although it's been replicated in other states, they've taken their own modifications to that program to best fit what meets their needs on a local level. So I just want to be clear that the federal agency, being NHTSA, really has been there to support the passing through of funds to allow states to do this important work.
As a sheriff, you know, being in law enforcement for 30 years, the DOJ, you've heard of consent decrees. I mentioned it earlier in my talk here, and the 13 different agencies. And Mr. San Diego referenced Sheriff Arpaio in Arizona with the racial profiling. And I believe the Department of Justice investigated that. I don't believe it was DOT or NHTSA. And in Texas, this racial profiling report, it's done annually, and the report is very, very specific. It asks for race, and there may be many members on this committee have no idea what I'm talking about, but it asks for race. Do you know on that report, each and every traffic stop, the 23,000 that I mentioned, you have to answer yes or no whether there was a search of that vehicle and whether there was consent to search that vehicle? I don't know if people even realize that that took place. Do you know there's a question
Could he
on there
answer
you
the
have to respond that says that did the officer know the race of the violator before the stop even took place? So the point is, all the data is there in the great state of Texas. That data is reported to HPD City Council. In my county, it was reported to Commissioner's Court, and that is collected in the receptacle by TCLO. So the information is there. So I believe that this is more of a local issue. If there is racial profiling being done, if there is bias or injustice, it would be done at the local level, and we should start holding our chiefs of police and maybe the mayors and others accountable. But there has to be some accountability, but I believe it needs to be kept at the local level. If there's criminal activity, Department of Justice needs to come in and investigate it. But I think NHTSA has an enormous amount of work to do. I know that Ms. Martin talked about the increase of fatalities, and that is sad, but NHTSA is too busy right now with everything else to get involved in this discussion.
The gentleman's time is long expired. I'm not sure there was a question there, but I want to move on now to Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Professor Ray, again, welcome to the committee. Thanks for your testimony, in which you mentioned that since 2017, the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland has developed over 100 virtual reality scenarios. You testified that you've trained and worked with over 2,000 police officers in large, mid-size, and small departments across the country to develop and implement a virtual reality decision-making program for law enforcement. So I just have a few questions. First is this virtual reality program ready to scale? And if so, what does that look like logistically?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. So yes, we are prepared to scale. We've worked with police officers in various places around the country. Including Maryland, obviously, but North Carolina, Ohio, Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee. What it looks like logistically, what we've done up to this point is we fly groups of officers into our labs, that space that people were able to see on the images and the videos. We take them through our program. It takes about 4 hours to go through. Oftentimes they'll go through several scenarios, but we are also equipped to be virtual and with resources to go to specific departments. That's one of the big things that departments ask us. They say, hey, can we get this? Sometimes it's a funding issue for them at the local level to be able to bring our equipment and what we do to them. We also have a train the trainer course, which people who are part of the Department of Homeland Security have participated in to use our program to train their own officers.
Thank you. How do you ensure the protection of information and data? You're collecting a lot of it during these scenarios. You outlined to the committee the types of data. And so how do you protect it, and where is the information housed or stored? Who has the custody of it?
Mm-hmm. So the data are stored on password protected devices at the University of Maryland. When we set this up at specific police departments, it's housed there in a similarly secure data file. Importantly, though, is we really uphold confidentiality and anonymity. We never ask personal identifying information, no names, no badge numbers. Instead, it's simply demographic information, and we examine what we do at the group level. Also importantly, as members of Congress know, at universities, one important part for oversight is we have what's called institutional review boards. We call them IRB. For any type of research we conduct, it has to be approved by a committee. Oftentimes, we have a series of revisions. With this project, that's definitely been the case. And so we have a lot of protocols in place to protect officers. I have a series of police officers in my family, and I understand the importance of protecting their confidentiality and anonymity and allowing them to train in a safe environment so that then they can get on the street to reduce bias, to treat people in a way that allows them to protect and serve.
So you mentioned the work that you've done with Prince George's Police Department. That's the county that I have the privilege of representing, at least part of it, along with Mr. Hoyer. Do you just work with departments from the Maryland area, or are you able to offer this program to departments across the country?
Yes, we are definitely able to offer it to departments around the country. And I mean, as to date, we've worked with departments from North Carolina, from Ohio, Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri. And I should be clear that we've worked with large, medium-sized, and small departments. That was really, really important for us. I'm originally from Tennessee. I went to grad school in Indiana, did a postdoc in California. Now I'm in Maryland. I've lived all over the country. And one thing that I know is that a lot of small and medium-sized departments, particularly those in rural America, get left out of programs like this. We wanted to ensure that our program was set up where we will be able to work with those departments. And we do have the capacity to do that, to take it to scale. And with the proper resources, we're able to bring small departments to us. And then for larger departments, we're able to outfit them with the proper equipment and technology, and then provide logistical and software support to help them be able to use our program long term.
Well, thank you, Professor Ray, and I see that my time's about to expire. I will abide by the time allocated through the rules of the committee. I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing at the University of Maryland, the work that you're doing at Brookings. Thank you for testifying today, and it sounds like this program, which is well developed, well thought out, and can be tailored to so many different departments, is something that's valuable. And with additional federal funding, I'm hoping to see it in departments across the country. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his questions, and now I recognize Mr. Stauber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to echo my colleagues' frustration with this hearing and their sentiments highlighting our lack of jurisdiction on many of these issue areas. Additionally, it is more frustrating that we are foregoing important time to discuss legitimate transportation issues to discuss a topic that we have a solution for. The solution is the Justice Act that I introduced last Congress and again earlier this month. The bill has received bipartisan support and will improve community policing standards that have been discussed during this hearing. It is more ironic and frustrating that the Bipartisan Justice Act was held up by Speaker Pelosi last Congress for purely political reasons. As Americans called out for justice and action, Speaker Pelosi took the partisan route instead of aiming for change. The cheap political win reared its ugly head again, even when it came to something like improving our policing and community safety. Unfortunately, despite our fellow Americans' calls for action, it sounds like partisanship is the path that will be taken once again. I do appreciate many of my colleagues' sentiments during this hearing, both Democrats and Republicans. Many of my Republican colleagues have already joined my bill as co-sponsors, but I would like to formally extend the offer to my friends on the other side of the aisle. It sounds like all of our intentions to improve our communities are legitimate and thoughtful, and we have the solution to improve our policing, and that is the Justice Act. To my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I have a co-sponsor sheet with me today and would love if any of my Democratic colleagues would like to come on over, or I can come to you to sign this piece of legislation and help institute real bipartisan change in our communities. I have a couple of clean pens as well to sign on to that bill. My question to any of the panelists, and by the way, I thank you so much for coming today. My 23 years of law enforcement in the third largest city in Minnesota, the city of Duluth, has served me well in this position. My question is, can any of the panelists give me their definition of community policing?
Who is your question
And I have no
for?
problem.
Madam Chair, any of the panelists that would like to answer that, can anyone give me their definition of community policing?
Yeah, I have no problem jumping in on this question. I've examined law enforcement for over a decade and mentioned before that I have law enforcement in my family. Community policing is not just about, say, playing basketball with a kid or patrolling a neighborhood, but instead it's about being affiliated with that neighborhood. It's about being a part of that neighborhood. It's about experiencing that neighborhood, sending your kids to that neighborhood, sending your kids to the school, working out at the gym. And oftentimes we see this in more affluent neighborhoods. Oftentimes they might be predominantly white, but we're less likely to see that in low-income communities. They tend to be more communities of color. So I think part of what a lot of people want, and the research that we've conducted at Laser suggests, is that people want similar sorts of relationships with law enforcement that they see people in other neighborhoods having. And I think when we talk about community policing, it's also giving law enforcement certain resources to be in those communities. There's a large study documenting that in some of the largest cities around the country, that police officers, similar to teachers, cannot afford to live there. And so we need to ensure that there are certain incentives that help them to be in those spaces to experience the community.
So,
the other thing we found is
one
that
moment.
minority officers
One
are more
moment.
likely to
Sir,
live in
one
communities
moment.
than white officers are
Have
not.
have you read the Justice Act?
Yes, I have. Yeah, thoroughly.
Okay.
That's one of the things that I do as a policy analyst. Yes, sir.
Perfect. And what you just said supports the Justice Act. So to the witnesses and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, here's a real simple definition of community policing. Community policing is you do not police your community, you police with your community. It'll bring lasting, trusting, long-term relations and help that community and help the officers serve the community and the community benefits. It's a mutual beneficial way to police, and I think we've lost the community policing concept. We have to get it back, and I really, really appreciate your comments. And I appreciate you reading the Justice Act, because if you, and you told me you did read the Justice Act, then I believe you support the Justice Act. It has tremendous legislation that needed changes even before you were in law enforcement. Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I appreciate his questions. Mr. Pappas. You are recognized, Mr. Pappas. Mr. Lamb. Mr. Lamb, you are recognized. Mr. Auchincloss, you are recognized. Ms. Napolitano, you are recognized.
Chair, I don't know, I had to leave the meeting for a few minutes, so I'm not sure if it was covered before, but I'm concerned about the test for marijuana by law enforcement officers. Do they have an effective test to be able to determine if it's impairment of anything, including marijuana? Anybody?
Ma'am, I could take that. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of research going on right now of how best to understand if a driver is impaired by marijuana. It's not the same as alcohol where you can test somebody's blood. I'm not a medical professional, but I've been told that marijuana is in your fat cells and not your blood, and it can stay in your body for a long time. So this is a challenging one, and it's one that we do need to get our hands around as more and more states do legalize it. And we know that there's an increase usage of it by folks that are behind the wheel. So right now, the most important thing is for us to understand if someone is impaired, and drug recognition experts, people trained to understand that, is probably our best weapon until we understand how we can have some technology to help us.
Anybody else? The question about the cars being outfitted like Volvo for drug impairment recognition, how far are we on that research with the cars? And can we impose upon the lawmakers, the car makers, the importance of having some cars themselves? Anybody?
I can take that one as well. We are fairly along, as we heard from the representative from MAD, Ms. Hawkins. There is technology to know whether or not a driver is impaired by alcohol, and if they're over the blood alcohol level that our states demand, either 0.05 or 0.08. That does exist today, and it has been used successfully in automobiles. So there is an opportunity to have a message and have a position on whether or not we want those in our vehicles today. Other forms of impairment, including distracted driving and some of the other things that cause a driver to not be on their par, those are challenging too, but there are some technologies with cameras that some fleets use, and it's really worth us focusing on those technologies and figuring out how we do get them into our vehicles, both commercial and residential, as soon as viable.
To see how far along they are in implementing them in all cars, in all buses, and all trucks. Excuse me. How do we ensure law enforcement is not using traffic safety as a tool for immigration enforcement, neglecting the purpose of preventing fatal traffic accidents? Mr. Godino. Sandiego, pardon me.
I'm sorry, Congresswoman, could you repeat the question?
Well, we have law enforcement using it for immigration purposes. How would, excuse me, not using traffic safety as a tool for immigration enforcement, therefore neglecting the purpose of preventing fatal traffic accidents? How can we ensure that?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. I think what's important is that state and local law enforcement agencies focus on what they do best. And so when they focus on increasing transportation safety, when they focus on enforcing state and local law, then that's what makes the community safer, is because that's what they're experts on. That's what they do well.
If I can also chime in, what we've consistently found in Connecticut and other states we've worked in is that when law enforcement use the traffic code to primarily focus on the safety of the roadways, not only is the safety of the roadways improved, but we see decreased racial and ethnic disparities. When traffic enforcement starts to be used as a crime reduction tool, when it starts to be used as an immigration tool, not only does it drive up racial and ethnic disparities, it also reduces trust and legitimacy in police, and it impacts the safety of the roadways because attention, time, and resources are being taken away from those stops that we know cause accidents and death.
But we do not punish any law enforcement agencies, not just the police officers, the agencies, for not following the law. How do we go around that?
I don't have a comment on that. I'm mostly focused on the data. I know in Connecticut we have outlawed the type of policing practice that you're speaking about, and we've had good success in that here in Connecticut.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. I thank her for her questions. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Steele. I'm sorry, that's Ms. Steele.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and our ranking member, and thank you to the witnesses here. We all agree and support the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's mission to save lives, prevent injuries, and reduce vehicle-related crashes. I know everyone on this committee supports improving traffic safety and also recognizes the importance of an equal enforcement of our laws. We can all agree that discrimination is anti-American and goes against everything this nation stands for. When I was the chairwoman of the Orange County Board of Supervisors, I created a Law Enforcement Appreciation Day. In Congress, I remain committed to supporting our heroes. Any attempts to defund the local law enforcement will only lead to a surge in crimes and unsafe communities. We must make sure that we are safe, and we must ensure that there is more training and community policing. I welcome a discussion about traffic safety and am proud to have worked with the district attorney in Orange County to highlight the dangers of impaired driving. However, the Safety Administration has no authority over the enforcement of traffic safety laws, so I am concerned that our hearing today focuses on law enforcement instead of safe roads. In Orange County, traffic and congestion are some of the biggest hurdles of our daily commuters. We all support safe roads, highway improvements, and vehicle modernization. On that note, I have one question for Ms. Martin. Besides California, how are states and cities working to reduce congestion? What improvement need to be made to ensure there are fewer distracted drivers on the road?
Thank you for that question, ma'am. And I'll take the first one on congestion. And road design is so important to understanding how you're using your roadways today and what kind of congestion you have, whether that's cars or pedestrians, as we've heard before, who are also at risk on our roadways. So one of the most important things is to understand where those congestion issues are, where your fatalities and injuries are, and then to partner with both your communities and your transportation engineers to see if there's some things that you can do to design those roads to be less congested and less deadly, basically. And there are simple things that can be done in many communities that can reduce fatality rates. Some of them are in my written testimony, but just simple things like rotaries and whatnot that require people to slow down and can create a more safe intersection. So it's really important. The other thing is public transportation, which is buses are one of our safest transportation methodologies right now in some of our urban areas, and making sure that those are safe and available to folks that feel comfortable using them and that they can access them easily with covered bus stops and other kinds of mechanisms to make sure that getting from their home to the bus stop is safe. Sidewalks, as I mentioned before. So some of those fundamentals are really important to addressing safety and congestion related issues. When we think about distracted driving, we would really propose that there be some primary enforcement rules. And I know several folks here on the committee have endorsed legislation to say that drivers basically can be pulled over for distracted driving activities, whether it's cell phone usage or other kinds of operations in the vehicle. Those are really strong enforcements. We've talked about enforcement here a lot. It's an important tool to getting safety on our roadways, whether it's law enforcement officers or other alternatives. Enforcement is one way we change human behavior, and distracted driving is on the increase for all the reasons we heard in the open testimonies with technologies in cars, and it's really important that we address that with some legislation.
Thank you, Ms. Martin. Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member, and witnesses. I yield the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlewoman for her questions. I next call on Mr. Balderson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for being here. My question is for Ms. Ramsey Hawkins and Ms. Martin, but first I'd like to thank Ms. Ramsey Hawkins for sharing your story with us today. Last Congress, I introduced the Drug Impaired Driving Education Act with my colleague, Congresswoman Kathleen Rice of New York. This bill would establish an annual $5 million grant program for states to educate the public on the dangers of drug-impaired driving. I'm proud that this bill was endorsed by both the National Safety Council and Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and I look forward to working with Congresswoman Rice and your organizations to continue this effort and reintroduce this bill in the 117th Congress. Ms. Martin, you noted in your testimony that alcohol, marijuana, and opioid prevalence increased among seriously and fatally injured road users during the second quarter of 2020 as compared to the months before the public health emergency. I know my friend from Illinois is the ranking member of this subcommittee, touched on drug-impaired driving earlier, but I was hoping you and Ms. Ramsey Hawkins could spend a few minutes discussing the importance of public education campaigns on drug-impaired driving and your efforts your organizations have taken to reduce drug-impaired driving on our roadways.
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is so important. As I mentioned before, every day almost ways based on impaired and alcohol specifically related crashes. It is so important that we educate on what it means to be impaired behind the wheel, and specifically related around alcohol. Some of the things that we can do are the campaigns that we've had in the past and doubling down on those. During the pandemic, we have seen increased use of all kinds of substances, and we're not here to talk about opioids and other kinds of substance use disorders, but anxiety, mental health, all of these things often get exacerbated, and they're complementary, unfortunately, in causing people to be impaired, and alcohol is certainly one of those. All of those statistics regarding the residents of our nation right now are climbing, and it is alarming because many of those folks unfortunately do get behind the wheel when they are under those kinds of stresses. So it's really important for us to get back to basics. That's educating, that's enforcement, and some of the technology that we talked about before. Only one state in our union here has gone to a 0.05 for blood alcohol level. That's one we support. Other states and other nations around the world have much more stringent requirements around that, and it's something that we could do fairly easily in our nation, and it would have drastic positive impacts for us.
Okay, I do have one follow-up for you. Could you discuss, and you've talked a little bit about this, but can you discuss the challenges or differences of educating the public on the dangers of drug-impaired driving, especially related to the opioids and marijuana, versus driving under the influence of alcohol?
Yeah, thank you. Our nation has really addressed the alcohol-related driving issue for decades, and that's wonderful because we have made progress, nowhere near enough, as we just heard from the opening testimony from Ms. Hawkins. No life should be lost on our roadway at all, for any reason, and certainly not because of an impaired driver. There are a lot of folks that are under misinformation, or that you can drive better when you're under the influence of cannabis. So education campaigns are really desperately needed right now, especially as states start to legalize more across our nation. The same it goes for other substances, as you referenced, whether it's opioids, and that those are impairing. It's why it says on the bottle, don't operate heavy equipment. A car is heavy equipment, and we need to educate both in the general public, and I would call on employers as a great place, because many of their employees drive on their behalf, and roadway-related or vehicle-related fatalities is still the #1 killer in our employment. So it's important to get their voice in this, that it's not just alcohol. Any substance that causes you not to be on par, or even fatigue, which is not a substance, but you're not on par, means you shouldn't be operating in a safety-sensitive operation, and a car is one of those.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate your answers. Madam Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his questions. I next call on Ms. Gonzalez Colon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I got a question to Ms. Lorraine Martin. Ms. Martin, I was revising here, and can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if you're aware that in Puerto Rico there are 3.2 million American citizens living there, and there are another 8,000 people living in the other 4 territories. I think by excluding these 400,000 people, we cannot have a road to zero if we don't have an accurate representation for all Americans with meaningful and complete data. So my first question to you will be is to actually ask you to include Puerto Rico and the other territories in the data that you collect for annual traffic deaths. That for me is the most important. The second, I don't know if you're aware that in Puerto Rico, if you are more than 6 months behind or $2,500 behind your child support, you can lose your lease issued by the state. And my question, do you think this should be left to the state to resolve?
Well, thank you very much. An important issue that we have weighed in on, this issue that you can use somebody's license or their ability to drive as something that you can have as a penalty for other non-roadway, non-risky driving behavior remediation. And we do not support that. We do think a license removal should be associated with driving-related incidences, not things like alimony or any other kind of action that a state or locality might be concerned with you on. Your license shouldn't be the thing that we use. And the simple fact is it often exacerbates whatever the problem is you're trying to solve. If somebody can't pay a fine, and now you've taken their car away, they perhaps can't get to work or can't get to their health care or get to the grocery store for their family. And so it actually increases the inequities that we're trying to address here. And we strongly support the Drive for Opportunity Act that would say that license removal really should only be done for unsafe driving related practices.
So how can individuals who have not paid civil fines can be incentivized to pay current fees other than to lose those privileges specifically?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question, ma'am, on how to incentivize someone to pay a fee. And we strongly recommend that it not be the removal of their license. There's got to be other ways to assist one of our residents in our country of addressing those issues.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I now call on Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Chair Lady. It's Burchett, but I appreciate the good effort on my name. Thank you. Ms. Hawkins, I'm a parent as you are, and I got started a little later, but my heart goes out to you, and I can't tell you how much that hurts me that you've lost a loved one. I could never experience anything like that, and I hope I never do. And thank you so much for the courage to be here, ma'am. Dr. Ray, thank you for the testimony on the innovative use of virtual reality technology. I'd like to know who pays for your training. Is it Department of Justice?
No, sir. So we have grants that we receive, like any other research that we would do. So it's various. It's been various outlets over the years. We've had some local police departments that have paid for the trainings that they've went through. We've gotten grants from nonprofits. So it's kind of been a hodgepodge of things, which is similar to what happens in the academic space.
Say that again. It's similar to the academic what?
Just similar to how academics aim to get grant money. So it's been a series of entities, but it has not been the Department of Justice.
Okay. Ms. Martin, are you concerned at all that your testimony recommends spending limited traffic safety funding on programs that do not have direct linkages to traffic safety?
I am not clear which ones those would be, sir. I would say that our focus is on all of the different kaleidoscope of things we need to do to help our residents be safe. And those will be across what we call the 4 E's, and that is education, enforcement, which we've talked a lot about here today, and then engineering, technology, how we design our streets. All of those go into making sure that we have safe transportation for all of our residents, not just for a few. And on top of that, we would then say the 4th E is going to be equity and making sure that we do enforcement, education, and engineering with the communities in mind that we're serving and understanding what their current risks are on our roadways.
Okay. Chair Lady, I will yield back the remainder of my time. Thank you.
Well, I thank the gentleman for his questions. I next recognize Mr. Auchincloss.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today and for their commitment to equity and transportation safety enforcement. Ms. Martin, I'd like to direct this line of inquiry to you. You mentioned in your testimony that people of color, older adults, low-income communities are underrepresented in the investments made in transportation improvements. And you also highlighted at the latter portion of your written testimony the importance of infrastructure investments and how we engineer safe streets. Could you speak perhaps for a minute or two about what role dedicated bus lanes play in improving safety, especially in high poverty communities? And
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, dedicated bus lanes really do help to reduce traffic congestion, as I mentioned to the Congresswoman just a moment ago, but also to create the ability for the safest mode of operation to be used within many of our communities, and that is busing. We need to make sure that those bus access points are safe as well, with some kind of shelters. And as I mentioned, we need to make sure wherever people are coming from to get to their bus stops, is that that's safe for them to traverse, because they're most likely going to be on foot if they're taking a bus. So we need to look at the sidewalks, the infrastructure, making sure that they're not having to pass highways to get to their bus stop, which in some communities they do. So it's really getting in touch with the community, understanding how they are going to use that public transportation and making sure it's safe for them to do so.
Many of these decisions that you're describing about bus safety are local or state level decisions. Could you address what role the federal government might have in incentivizing better decision making that's informed by data about what we know works, both in the United States and also in cities around the world, especially in Europe and Asia, that have really effective bus lanes?
They do. Some of the grant programs we've heard about here today with 1906 and other programs under NHTSA that highlight where we know there are proven success stories, what we know works, and then providing federal funds to help states with implementing those programs. I mean, that's a very powerful tool. We've heard some testimonials here from Connecticut and other places where they've used those funding, and I would endorse increased funding specifically on the areas where we know best practices around the world have saved lives.
Many of these best practices around the world are focused on bus rapid transit, which has a pretty tightly defined scope. It has high population density. It's got 90-second headways. It's got on-platform or on-level platform boarding, off-board ticketing. Could you speak to which of those elements, if you had to sort of, in many areas, especially in my district, bus rapid transit in totality may not work right off the bat, but there could be elements of that you could implement. Could you speak to maybe the most effective elements of bus rapid transit that could be put together piece by piece for incremental improvements?
Yeah, it's probably best for me to get back to you on that one with some details. As I talked about here, I think the lanes are really important, as is the actual shelters or the access point to the bus that's become, in some cases, a high safety risk. So if I can take that for the record, I'll get back to you with some additional information.
Absolutely. My office would welcome the opportunity to work with you on this. I want to raise one other modality, which is micromobility and protected bicycle lanes. And both in the public sector and the private sector, as a city councilor, as a product manager in an innovation lab for an insurance company, I saw how effective micromobility lanes can be. Oftentimes, putting in protected infrastructure, though, takes a back seat in transportation safety improvements. And it also oftentimes requires taking away parking spots in cities and towns, which can be very unpopular. Can you speak to any research that you've seen or data that supports or does not support the idea that protected micromobility lanes both enhance access to jobs and services and also increase safety for mobility?
Yeah, they do both, sir, and we do have research that shows that. And we're seeing more and more pedestrian fatalities, which were already noted in this hearing. So it's a place that we need to make sure that if more and more folks are using other mobilities, other forms of mobility, micromobility, whether it's scooters or bicycles or their own 2 feet, that they have to be able to do that safely. And the death rates are up, and we know the usage is up. So we would say that there are things you can do to design your roadways with dedicated bike lanes, making sure you have sidewalks, understanding what the safety of scooters needs to be, since that's kind of still evolving for us. All of those can help us help with mobility and help with safety at the same time.
Similar follow-up to the bus lanes. Is there a particular area where you think the federal government can be especially impactful in inducing states and cities to put in protected micromobility infrastructure?
Well, the legislation called Complete Streets that was introduced last Congress, we would highly support that, and it's a great place to look.
And introduced, I believe, by my home state senator, Mr. Ed Markey, which I strongly support. Thank you, Ms. Martin, for your time, and I yield back the balance.
I thank the gentleman for his questions. Now, I'm going back to Ms. Gonzalez Colon because the timer had stopped working, and I believe she had not finished her questions. I apologize. Ms. Gonzalez Colon, you can proceed with your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was surprised that my time was expired when I was less than 2 minutes, and thank you for going back. I was making a question directly to Ms. Martin, and I will go back now. And I was actually going through her testimony, saying that she was discussing the benefits of automated enforcement as an evidence-based countermeasure to change driver behavior. However, states such as Iowa threat this technology as a civil penalty without reporting tickets to law enforcement. And it's a means to generate revenue. 13 million photos were taken by a specific traffic camera, and 130,000 individuals were ticketed solely by one traffic camera, dubbed as a revenue camera. However, there are other states who threat these fines as a criminal charge, allowing individuals to challenge these tickets in court. And we can see examples of this in different states. My question will be, what is the best way to address these cameras to elicit behavioral change rather than just raising revenue?
Yeah, thank you. And as I mentioned earlier, we do support automated enforcement because if it's used appropriately, it can help you not only create better behavior on your roadways, because people do change their behavior if they know there's a camera that might catch them speeding or going through a red light. So they do relate to safety, but they have to be done fairly, equitably, and as I mentioned before, they should only be done to increase safety, not for revenue purposes, not for any other kind of actions that a municipality may be taking with their residents. It should be for safety and safety alone. We have a checklist that we give to jurisdictions, and I'd be happy to provide it to you and others that helps you make those decisions. And clearly, these cameras should be put in places where you know you have your highest fatalities, where you have your highest speeders, not just in a community because you'd like to increase enforcement there.
And how will situations like this affect reciprocity for other means, such as tolling?
I'm sorry, the question, ma'am, please?
I mean, situations like this will affect reciprocity for other means, such as tolling.
Oh, tolling?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I've looked at that issue. I'd have to get back to you on that, the connection between automated enforcement and tolling. Let me take that for the record as well, please.
Thank you. And my last question will be to Mr. Sandigo. My question, and I heard the question Ms. Brownie was making to you, and I was a little bit shocked as well. The Community Advisory Board came up with recommendations to include racial disparities in traffic stop, right? Including stop length, search rates, citation rates, arrest rates, seizures rates, and the initial reasons for stopping drivers. How that information change behaviors?
Thank you so much for the question. And I do want to clarify that the court ordered those reforms. The Community Advisory Board was instrumental in communicating that to the community and getting their feedback on it. I think what it allowed everyone to see and to know is where actually the disparities were happening. Was it happening on who they were choosing to stop? Was it happening on the length of the stop or who was being arrested? And so the fact that it looked at different factors allowed the agency to zero in on where the reform needed to happen. And it also looked at whether it was an individual outlier or whether it was a matter of policy that needed to be addressed in order to implement reform in those areas.
Thank you, Mr. Sandigo. I know that my time is going to expire now. I will just make a final question. Will it be helpful if we include language here to in the forthcoming surface transportation bill that made funding either for programs more accessible for there are just 7 states that can actually get access to the back test and do the 24/7 program. And, the blood alcohol content test before, those kind of programs. I don't know if we need to include that in the surface test. I don't know if somebody may want to add those comments for the record. I know my time expires, so I want to thank the chairwoman for allowing me to have my time back. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm pleased that the gentlelady could pick up on her time. As I'm hearing this testimony, I'm beginning to wonder if, for example, we had testimony earlier that Blacks were stopped as often as whites, and I wonder if this is because of stops in Black neighborhoods or Black communities, as opposed to stops of Blacks in communities that are white. So that's something I want to find out as a result of this hearing. Next, I want to call on Mr. Strickland. Ms. Strickland, I'm sorry, Ms. Strickland. I'm going to go next while we wait. Sorry? Ms. Strickland, would you unmute? Ms. Strickland? You are muted.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
All right, sorry about that. Here we are. Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Davis. Traffic safety enforcement is top of mind for many of my constituents at home. And not only does this testimony presented clearly lay out the disparities that exist nationwide, the disastrous effects make our lives unsafe when we drive. And back in Washington State, for example, there are legislative proposals being offered to combat the cycle of poverty that actually results from traffic enforcement. So this is a very timely hearing, and I appreciate all the comments. So as we talk about the importance of traffic stop and collecting data, and this is what really this is about, and the grants that Congress can authorize to help states, it's worth noting that a number of third-party studies attest to the same results. A study led by Stanford University found that Black and Hispanic drivers get pulled over more than white drivers, except at night when officers have difficulty seeing drivers' faces. A San Diego State University study attested the same, as did a study at the University of South Carolina. So this is for Mr. Barone. From your experience, sir, what real-world differences can happen when states themselves maintain and make public available statistical information on each motor vehicle stop made by law enforcement? And how can the federal government better support our states by making these targeted efforts to reduce racial bias in policing? Thank you.
Thank you, Representative, for the question, and the very important question at that. Transparency is key to legitimacy in policing, and it is the first step to rebuilding trust in law enforcement and the communities they serve. Beyond that, simply sharing data is step one. Step two is having the people that know what that data says to sit down with community stakeholders and law enforcement and figure out why the data looks the way it does. I'll tell you from our experience here in Connecticut, we have 107 police agencies. Every year we did our annual report starting in 2014. We saw significant racial and ethnic statewide disparities. And we would identify a group of departments that were really contributing to that disparity more so than others. We began to work with them, to have interventions with them, to figure out what are the factors driving these disparities and getting departments to make changes. The most recent report that we've published has shown a significant decrease over the last 6 years in statewide racial and ethnic disparities. Why? Because we've had time to intervene in 28 of our 107 departments, all 28 departments doing a little something to reduce the disparity in their department, which has contributed to an overall reduction in the statewide basis. So people often think this can be done overnight. There needs to be vigilance. There needs to be continued collection, continued analysis, and continued conversations. You know, I know sometimes people don't want to hear this, but slow and steady wins the race. We've been at this thoughtfully and methodically in Connecticut for almost a decade now, and our work is finally paying off. The longer we wait, the longer it will pay off in other states. And the 1906 program is a great place to start for the federal government to be able to support this type of state level work.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And to be clear, as our witnesses testified today, this is a safety issue. This is about safety. And when there's not equity in enforcement, there is one less officer getting an unsafe driver off the road to protect all of us. So now for Ms. Hawkins or Mr. Barone or Mr. Ray, based on your research experience, how can addressing this issue of bias with data, with collecting it, with reporting and analyzing it, actually improve our roadway safety?
I'll start and just say that we now have lots of data that tells us when police focus on the things that have the biggest contributor to accidents, speeding, traveling too closely, talking on their cell phone, drinking and driving, we see very little racial and ethnic disparities in the data because they're focused on the violation. When policing starts to use traffic laws as a crime reduction tool, it tends to drive disparities. We also know that drivers commit motor vehicle violations at the same rate, regardless of their race. And police will find what they're looking for where they look for it. But we know that they look for different violations in Black and brown communities than they do in white communities. And in some regards, we've created a self-fulfilling prophecy, this idea that Black and brown drivers are more likely to have an administrative offense, and somehow that's linked to poverty. But we know that police run, for example, plates in Black and brown communities at a significantly higher rate than they do in white communities to look for these administrative offenses. So the knowledge that this program has been able to do is to inform that, to start asking questions. Why are you running plates here and not here? Right? Why are you doing speed enforcement here and not here? And how is that linked to traffic safety? And so all of this can come together. And as I continue to say, we can create win-win scenarios. We can improve traffic safety and eliminate racial disparities.
All right. Well, thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for her questions. Mr. Cohn, I recognize Mr. Cohn at this time.
Thank you, Chair Norton. I want to thank you for holding this hearing, and particularly on this Black History Month, when it's so important and most pertinent, as you mentioned in your opening remarks. Disparities in the criminal justice system, particularly police enforcement, have been a major source of political protest and social unrest in our country, and rightfully so. Too many instances where a routine traffic stop has turned into a tragic loss of life. Research has confirmed law enforcement officers pull off minority drivers at a higher rate than Caucasian drivers. My city of Memphis, which is 65.5% African American and has a large Hispanic population as well, this is a particularly disturbing statistic. The racial profiling of drivers by law enforcement sows divisions and distrust, and ultimately distracts from the intended goal to save lives, prevent injuries, and reduce vehicle-related crashes on our nation's roadways for all individuals. We must do better, and we can improve and get away from this unconstitutional racial profiling. My Police Training and Independent Review Act, which will be part of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, provides resources for diversity training for law enforcement agencies. It's important they have those diversity trainings. This committee is engaged in this important work and included provisions in the bills to address this issue, including creating a grant program for universities to conduct implicit bias research, reauthorizing Section 1906 programs, which gives funding to states to collect and analyze traffic stop data and prevent racial profiling. I appreciate the witnesses' testimony and the insight that they have provided. Mr. Barone, let me ask you this question. Your findings state that Black and Hispanic drivers are stopped more frequently by law enforcement for vehicle equipment and administrative-related driving offenses, despite there being no evidence Black and Hispanic drivers commit these offenses more often than white drivers. Based on your experience working with law enforcement agencies, have you found officers believe vehicle-related violations correlate to dangerous driving behaviors, or are they just an excuse to stop somebody who they might be able to make a collar on?
I found that in some regards, Representative, that in law enforcement, we've created self-fulfilling prophecies, right? So this idea that there's a connection between socioeconomic status and the maintenance of the equipment of your vehicle or administrative offenses And therefore, when police are asked to go in Connecticut, for example, to ensure that vehicles are properly registered, they tend to go look for those violations where their implicit bias tells them they think they're more likely to find them. And when they run plates, for example, and they find unregistered vehicles, it then reaffirms what they previously believed. Yet we know that if the same exposure was made, police running plates, for example, in predominantly white neighborhoods, we know that they would find administrative offenses at the same rate. And so, frankly, the conversations we've had with law enforcement have been informative to them as well. Them realizing that that the correlations that they thought existed don't necessarily exist. And we've worked to help them to say, what is the issue that you're trying to address? If you're trying to address unregistered vehicles on your roads, let's figure out the most fair and equitable way for law enforcement to look for those violations. If you're trying to address
Thank you, Mr. Barone. I think my time is kind of winding down. I'm not sure, but I wanted to ask Ms. Martin. You addressed the issue of people of color in low-income communities being overrepresented in pedestrian fatalities and underrepresented in investments in their infrastructure. Mr. Auchincloss mentioned that Senator Markey, who at one time was a member of the House before he moved over to the other body, the lesser number of members, he's the sponsor of the bill, which I'm the sponsor of in the House, which is our Safe Streets Act. Are you familiar with the Safe Streets Act, Ms. Martin?
I am, and we fully support it at the National Safety Council.
What would be the areas you think we should prioritize in our legislation in the Safe Streets Act to see to it that racial misrepresentation and racial bias is eliminated?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is, like we've said throughout this, is to get the data and to understand where fatalities and injuries are occurring, and then to make sure we understand with the community support how roadways and infrastructure are being used, and then understand what kind of infrastructure enhancements, modifications can specifically address those hazardous areas. And we don't necessarily do that today. We often peanut butter investment across various communities. We don't necessarily use the data of fatalities and injuries to make our investment decisions. But it's really important that we do that, because all of the data shows in the places that we do have it, that peoples of color and minority communities have higher fatalities, have higher injuries. That's where we should be spending our money. That's where we should be putting our infrastructure dollars.
Thank you, Ms. Martin. We hope to pass that bill this year. There is always less money put into the minority communities, sidewalks, shrubberies, different things that are medians that can make the streets more attractive, but also safer. And then that's the purpose of the bill. And with that, it's nice to see Mr. Saulnier on here with his colorful background, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired, and I thank Mr. Cohen for his questions. Ms. Bordeaux. Ms. Bordeaux, you have 5 minutes. Ms. Bordeaux? Ms. Bordeaux, I believe you are muted. Ms. Bordeaux, will you unmute yourself? I think Ms. Bordeaux is having audio issues, so I'm moving on, hoping she can fix those. I'm moving on now to Mr. DeSaulnier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it's good to see my colleague from Tennessee as well, Mr. Cohen. And just a brief comment. I think it's really great, and I want to thank the panelists too, that we're having this discussion. Thank you to the chair for having it. Congressman Lee and I have had a series of town halls on race in general for the last 6 years. We had one last week with Reverend Cleaver from our good friend and colleague from Missouri. And it's just been a wonderful experience. We have regularly over 1,000 people join us for those town halls. And I think when we have these discussions about race in America, as we are today, on these transportation issues and law enforcement, when they're open and honest and evidence-based research, it's quite liberating, at least the feedback I've gotten. And and Congressman Lee on our initiative. So specifically, Mr. Barone, I want to thank you for your work, but also your passion for your work. You referenced in your testimony some research you did in New Haven, Connecticut, in a predominantly African-American community where traffic stops were accelerated, and your findings were compelling as to the efficacy of those that enforcement. I want to ask you, when you shared it with the local police department, these statistics, what happened with that information? Was it well received? Did it lead to any kind of policy changes specifically in that neighborhood and in New Haven?
Thank you for the question. The work that we've done in Connecticut has, a component of it has been to engage in the community in a dialogue about what policing looks like and what it should look like, but one that's informed based on the data. And so in the example I provided in my testimony, it was a predominantly white suburban community that bordered the city of New Haven that was focusing a lot of attention in a predominantly Black neighborhood within the community that also bordered the city, which is also predominantly Black and Hispanic. And the policing looked very different in that neighborhood and in that area than it did elsewhere in town. And the department was fairly open to engaging in a thoughtful dialogue with us about what was driving the disparities, why they believed those disparities existed. And we spent a long time working with the department to drill down on that. So they would say, for example, we place more cops in this area because we have more crime here. Okay, and so we would go back and look at that, and then we'd say, well, let's figure out what your police are doing and how that is helping to impact or reduce crime, and is that causing a disparity? And if it is, what can we do to address that? We were happy to report that because of the changes that we made and the dialogue that we had with the department and their willingness to engage in this dialogue with the community, it wasn't very long before their racial and ethnic disparity disappeared. Community trust increased, legitimacy in policing increased, and that was largely driven by their willingness to engage in this level of a thoughtful discussion. And we really took that model, that was early on. We started bringing that type of collaboration to the other agencies we worked with. In addition to working directly with departments, we also host several forums with the community and the police department and stakeholders in the basement of church halls and in town hall auditoriums to engage in this important dialogue. And that's a really important component of the work we do.
Just a follow-up on that. Having been a mayor of a city of 130,000 people here in the Bay Area that reasonably, well, is diverse and was diverse then, I think back of community-oriented policing 25, 30 years ago, and these cultural changes. And I just wondered, as a follow-up to your comments, how you find in engaging over time in cultures in local police departments that are more open, more based on community-oriented policing, and has that made a difference as far as you know over the last 3 decades?
It has been. These haven't always been easy conversations to have. I'll be honest with you, usually when we do our initial analysis, we drive down, we meet with the department, we sit across the conference table with them for a few hours. And those first few hours are often a little contentious, right? Nobody wants to be named in a report that says they might have an issue with race. But usually once we can let the data ground the conversation, we can start to move beyond some of the emotion that's brought to the table, and we can start to really look at what can be done to address the issue. And a big thing that we push for in our work is to not have it be done in a silo or in a vacuum, but to make sure that we bring community stakeholders into the conversation so that usually when law enforcement hear directly from the people they serve, they're a little bit more open to implementing those reforms that we've seen work.
Thanks, Mr. Ray. Just briefly, as my time is limited here, thank you, Madam Chair. Do you think that we could invest more in training, particularly for virtual training? Will that help? And do you have any research that would indicate that it would?
Yes, sir. Thank you for your question. Yes, most definitely. I mean, more resources for police departments, small, medium, and large. They want our training. With the resources, it will be beneficial. And as Mr. Barone was saying, we can really start to reduce the biases that exist and improve objectivity and equity.
Thank you. I just want to thank the chair again and all of the panelists. This is terrific. Your work's terrific. And look forward to working with you to deploy more of your efforts. Thanks so much. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his questions. And I'd like to next call on Ms. Williams. You have 5 minutes, Ms. Williams.
Thank you, Chairwoman Norton and Ranking Member Davis for convening this hearing today. So as we have been discussing during this conversation, the most common interaction between law enforcement and the public occurs at a traffic stop. For many Black and brown people in this country, a traffic stop is not a friendly nor routine encounter, as the event can quickly turn deadly. Ms. Martin, you mentioned alternatives to traditional enforcement, including the safe systems approach. Can you please elaborate on the success of this approach in cities and how it reduces inequities and implicit bias?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And one of the things that we know fundamentally is that our residents cannot be safe if they don't feel safe. And they need to both feel safe physically, and they need to feel safe when they interact with another human being, as you've just described in a traffic stop or law enforcement. We need to make sure that that is an experience that can be navigated appropriately. That said, there are additional ways of enforcement, as you've alluded to, and we've talked about automated enforcement as one of those ways that enables us to catch people with risky behavior without having to have a traffic stop per se, and can be done in equitable ways as long as it's done for safety and not for other means. And also safe systems. Safe systems means we design our roadways so that human beings who make mistakes and who do have risky behavior, that they can't necessarily do so. And they're reminded, like with rumble strips or rotaries, other ways to design our systems so that a traffic stop, a traffic enforcement activity doesn't have to happen in the first place.
Thank you. And so those are systems that local governments are already utilizing?
Yes, they are.
And so what should Congress consider in future legislation that can implement some of these mechanisms that local municipalities are currently using?
You know, we've talked before about some of the safe streets, complete streets. Those are going to be helped, that legislation. The bill that was passed the House last year, and hopefully will be considered again, has some really good safety related legislation in it that can help all the states if implemented. And on top of all that, we've talked about the NHTSA grants and making sure that they're focused on the places that can have the highest impact, making sure people use those grants and making sure that they're well funded. And where states don't choose to use the grants, allowing localities or municipalities underneath those states to perhaps also participate where today they can't.
Ms. Martin, also in your testimony, you stated that driving-related offenses should be the only cause for license suspensions. We know that there's a correlation between poverty and driver's license suspensions. While the decision to suspend driver's licenses are done at the state level, what role should Congress play in ensuring that the states do not suspend licenses for non-traffic-related violations?
Yeah, we talked before about the Driving for Opportunity Act that has been proposed, and we fully support that act. It does say that license suspension at state levels should only be done for driver-related offenses and severe, risk-based driver-related offenses. So I do think legislation could be helpful there, and we fully support that. It should not be something that exacerbates the inequities we've already been talking about here today.
Thank you so much, Ms. Martin. And as we close out Black History Month, it is important that we work together to ensure that transportation is equitable and free of implicit bias. So I appreciate your time today and your comments. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlewoman for her questions, and I'd like to now go back to Ms. Bordeaux, where we had some technical questions and she did not get to ask her questions. Ms. Bordeaux, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Oh, thank goodness. Thank you, Chairwoman Norton, I appreciate it. And thank you to all the witnesses here today to discuss the significant and very timely topic of equity in transportation safety enforcement. I'm glad we're talking about this topic today with African American and Latinx citizens who have been suffering the indignities of racially motivated traffic stops for decades. Further, the reports of Black people dying during or in the aftermath of traffic stops has really dominated the news cycles in including in the 7th Congressional District of Georgia. In my district, a 22-year-old black male motorist was assaulted, punched, and kicked by 2 Gwinnett County police officers during a routine traffic stop. Both officers and have faced criminal charges, but of course we want these problems not to happen in the first place. And it's very important to reiterate that the adverse experiences that Black and Brown people face when interacting with the police are real. This is not merely anecdotal or the stuff of conjecture. Racial profiling and implicit bias in traffic stops are well known and substantial problems, and there is extensive research on this issue showing this kind of bias in law enforcement. I know several people have asked about the Section 1906 grants that passed under safety and were reauthorized under the FAST Act. And one thing I want to point out is that since the program's inception, only 23 states have utilized this grant, and Southern states in particular have been notably absent. I think only 4 Southern states have actually used this grant. And yet it's clear that participating in this program would help reassure citizens of color that this issue is important enough to investigate. So just wanted to go back to you, Ms. Martin or Mr. Barone, if you want to chip in on this. How do we get states like Georgia to participate in this program? What are pieces of this that you see that might be barriers to states like Georgia in being involved in this grant program?
Well, I can start, but I do think Mr. Barone can provide some history because he's gone to other states and brought his incredible program there. The first thing is to show some examples, and that's what he has done so successfully, and how it has changed in a non-threatening, non-blame-based approach, the way that practices are implemented, and truly resulted in both more equity and safer streets, which is really what we're all after. As I mentioned before, we could consider when a state hasn't chosen to be part of the programs, whether localities could, towns, cities, and that may open things up a bit and give you an example in your state that you could bring more broadly. So that's just another thing to consider, and I'll give the time back over to the expert in Connecticut.
Thank you, Ms. Martin, and thanks for the question. I would agree with everything Ms. Martin said, and I would also go back to the comments I made earlier regarding the benefits of potentially allowing for technical assistance so that we can really ensure that states know that these resources are available, and to help states access the resources and put together a program that does exactly what we've been able to do in Connecticut, which is address equity and roadway safety. I think once people have a better understanding, for example, of what we've been able to do, it might incentivize them to want to engage in this program. And I also think in those states where maybe state lawmakers are less interested in a state approach, which we've been fortunate to have in Connecticut, allowing localities to potentially access these funds to do this type of work at the local level would also go a long way in showing the benefits of the program.
Great, thank you. I am definitely interested in finding ways to let localities access this program, make them aware of it, and help them use that. One other, I'm very interested in the application of technology, and it has often occurred to me that the highway patrol looking for people speeding could be replaced with just machines that click when people drive by. And in other countries, I once was in Switzerland, and if you go over a certain amount of the speed limit and you pass one of their devices, you are automatically mailed a speeding ticket. And I'm just curious, what are barriers to this kind of technology in this country? Has it been considered in some places? And obviously, it would take a lot of the bias out of some of those kinds of highway enforcement activities.
Yeah, I can comment on that one, ma'am. They have been very effective in some of our cities and towns, and very much so worldwide, of changing behavior, which is what we're trying to do. We're not trying to catch people or fine them. We want to change their behavior so they're safer on the roadway to begin with. And if they know there's a speed camera, which is kind of generically what you just referred to, they do slow down. And it's a very easy way to be equitable because everybody's in the same boat as they go by that camera, regardless. But again, we would say it needs to be used for safety, and for some of the towns that perhaps had some bumps in implementing these, it's because it was either perceived or perhaps explicit that part of it was revenue-based or for some other reason. So the checklist that we have is really helpful, I think, if you want to consider putting these in place, and the performance is there. We know it saves lives. So we're very supportive of that technology.
Great. Thank you so much for that, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I'm pleased to recognize Mr. Lynch at this time. You have 5 minutes, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate your kindness and for holding this hearing. Ms. Ramsey Hawkins, I want to thank you for your willingness to come before the committee today and to share your story, and for trying to take your own personal tragedy and turn it to a positive on behalf of other families so that they may not suffer the same fate. My condolences to you for your loss of your sons. And your story is far too common. In the United States today, according to the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, automobile crashes are the 13th leading category for causing deaths among young people, and the leading indicator for death among teenagers and young adults. In 2019, there were 36,000 people killed in motor vehicle accident crashes on U.S. roadways and an estimated 2.74 million injured. Now, we did make progress in this country between 2000 and 2010, when the number of fatalities from drunk driving accidents dropped significantly from 13,000 a year to 10,000, which is still far too many. But we have plateaued at that level since 2010, and there has not been a significant reduction thereafter. And I appreciate all the advocacy that you have done with Mothers Against Drunk Driving and representing families and victims. And I'm just curious if you see steps that Congress could take to make a meaningful impact on this terrible situation. You've spent many hours working on this, and you should be commended for your advocacy. But I would just like to give you an opportunity, if you have any perspective on what Congress can do next to help further lower that risk to young people and to families all across America.
Thank you, Congressman. What can we do? What can Congress do is continue to support programs that are in place, such as Dr. Ray's and Dr. Barone's, for us to continue to talk openly about what's happening in this country, and trust that between communities of color and law enforcement, we need fair and just enforcement. We need technology neutral rulemaking to mandate technology to prevent drunk driving. Until technology is mandated in all new vehicles, we need to have these conversations. We need to continue to fund community programs, and we just need to have open, honest dialogue about programs and solutions, and that must continue to occur.
Well, thank you. I just want to, again, I want to thank you for your courage in turning your own pain to the benefit of other families so that they may avoid suffering similarly. I want to thank you for your thoughtful advocacy and your energy in this cause. It's very, very important to a lot of American families. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank the gentleman for his question and for focusing on the witness who was a victim and survivor. That it's important to make sure that that testimony has the appropriate questions. Ms. Hawkins represented Mothers Against Drunk Driving. I would like to ask, are there any further questions from members of the subcommittee, either on webcam or in person? Seeing none, I want to thank each of our witnesses in particular for your very helpful testimony today. Your comments have been informative and helpful, and beyond that, your comments have been full of information and insights that I know I did not have. And I feel comfortable in saying that most members of the committee on both sides did not yet have, and that we need to take into account in any further legislation that is enacted. I now ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them further in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's very helpful hearings. Without objection, so ordered. The subcommittee stands adjourned.